long before any human army had ever marched across a plain, long before any king had sent soldiers into a rival city, long before anyone had invented the very concept of war, the gods were already fighting. Not with weapons made of iron or bronze, not with chariots or siege towers or armies drawn up in the dust of a battlefield. With something the Sumerian texts describe as far more dangerous than any of those things. With words spoken in a divine assembly, with the slow withdrawal of favour, with the deliberate and accumulating weight of grievances between two brothers who had once ruled the same world together and who came, through a sequence of events the ancient scribes preserved in extraordinary detail, to stand on opposite sides of the oldest and most consequential conflict in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia. The texts that describe this conflict are among the oldest written documents in the world. They were pressed into wet clay tablets in a script called cuneiform by scribes who worked in the temple complexes of Sumer more than 4,000 years ago, and some of the traditions they recorded are older still, carried through oral transmission across generations of priests and storytellers who memorized and recited these accounts in temple courtyards long before anyone had thought to write them down. What those texts describe, when read carefully and taken seriously as records of a sophisticated theological tradition, rather than dismissed as primitive mythology, is a story about power and inheritance and the catastrophic consequences of a divine hierarchy that could not manage the competing ambitions of its most important members. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always enjoy picturing where everyone is settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. To understand what triggered the first Anunnaki war, you need to understand something about the world in which the Anunnaki existed, because the ancient Mesopotamians did not think about their gods the way many modern people think about divine beings. The gods of Sumer were not remote, abstract presences operating from a position of detached perfection. They were active, emotionally complex beings who experienced ambition and jealousy and desire and fear in ways entirely recognizable to the human communities that worshipped them. They formed families, they held grudges, they celebrated victories and suffered defeats. They had favorite children and difficult siblings and old wounds that never quite healed. They made decisions they later regretted and entered into alliances that served their interests for a while, before collapsing under the pressure of competing needs. In short, they behaved in most of the ways that mattered, like the people who told stories about them, only at a scale and with consequences that stretched across the entire cosmos, rather than across a single city or a single generation. This is not a coincidence. The gods of Sumer were created by human minds working to understand a world that was genuinely difficult and genuinely unpredictable. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia was not a kind one. The two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were essential to life there but unreliable. They flooded at irregular times and with irregular intensities. A flood too small left fields dry and crops struggling. A flood too large overwhelmed the canal systems and destroyed entire communities. The summer heat was brutal. The surrounding desert was always pressing inward, threatening to reclaim the irrigated strips of land that separated civilization from emptiness. Out of that environment came a people who needed, more urgently than most, a framework for understanding why the world behaved as it did, and what, if anything, could be done about it. The gods they invented to answer that question were gods shaped by the world they were invented to explain. Unpredictable, powerful, emotionally real, organized into hierarchies that both enabled order and generated conflict in the same motion. The Anunnaki, as a divine family governing the cosmos through a hierarchy of rank and responsibility, reflected back to the Sumerians the kind of world they actually inhabited. A world where power was real and unequal, where rank mattered enormously, and the decisions of those at the top had consequences for everyone below them, where the personal relationships between powerful individuals could determine the fate of entire communities, and where cooperation and conflict were not opposites, but aspects of the same underlying structure. The divine world was a mirror of the human world, held up high enough that its features could be seen clearly, examined without the obscuring detail of daily life, and used to understand patterns that operated at every level of existence from the cosmic to the personal. With that understanding in place, the the story of what the Sumerian texts reveal about the first Anunnaki war becomes not just a religious narrative but something closer to a political analysis, a careful and sophisticated account of how power structures fail, of what happens when the rules governing a hierarchy are not strong enough to contain the ambitions of the people subject to them, of how a conflict that begins with a question about inheritance and legitimacy can escalate through a series of individually manageable incidents into something that reshapes the entire order of the world. The structure of the divine family is where the story begins, because everything that follows grows out of the specific arrangement of authority that the Sumerian cosmos was built on. At the summit was Anu, the sky god, the father of the divine assembly, the ultimate source of authority in the Sumerian cosmos. Anu did not involve himself directly in the day-to-day management of the earth and its affairs. He was elevated, distant, the kind of supreme authority that ratifies decisions and confers legitimacy, rather than administering them personally. His power was real, and recognized by all the other gods, but it was exercised through delegation, through the authority he bestowed on others to act in his name. Anu was the origin of legitimacy in the divine world, the source from which all rightful authority ultimately derived. Without his ratification, even the most powerful of the gods below him was operating on borrowed time. Below Anu, and deriving their authority from him, were the great gods who actually managed the world. Among these, two were primary, and their relationship to each other was the fault line along which everything else in the divine world was organized. Their names were Enlil and Enki. They were brothers, both sons of Anu, both among the most powerful beings in the Sumerian cosmos, and both possessed of qualities that made conflict between them not merely possible, but in retrospect, almost inevitable given the way the hierarchy had been constructed. Enlil was the lord of the air and the storm. His name meant lord of the wind, and everything about his characterization in the texts reflects that association with atmospheric power, with the force that moves invisibly across the world and makes its presence known through its effects on everything it touches. His voice was the thunder that rolled across the flat Mesopotamian plain before a storm. His breath was the wind that could be a gentle cooling presence in the summer heat, or a devastating force that stripped crops from fields and drove sand into the eyes of travelers. He was associated with the city of Nippur, which the Sumerians regarded as the spiritual center of the world, the place where the divine assembly gathered to decide the fate of humanity and the earth. His authority was explicitly political, directly concerned with the governance of human affairs, the establishment of kingship, the ordering of cities, and the stewardship of a set of divine principles called the Emi, that governed how civilized life was organized and maintained. The Emi deserve a moment of attention, because they are central to understanding what Enlil held and why that holding mattered so much in the conflict that was coming. The Emi were not simply a list of rules, they were the fundamental organizing principles of civilization itself, the conceptual foundations on which everything from temples to trade to the rhythms of agricultural life rested. They included kingship and priesthood, the craft of the smith and the weaver, the art of music and the science of writing, the institution of war and the practice of peace, the concept of truth and the capacity for deception. All of the activities and institutions that made human civilization what it was existed because the Emi existed, because these organizing principles had been established in the divine world and made available to the human world through the actions of the gods. Enlil was the god most directly associated with the governance and enforcement of the Emi, with ensuring that the cosmic order they defined was maintained and that deviations from that order were corrected. He was, in the most precise sense, the custodian of civilization's foundations, the one who decided what counted as order and what counted as deviation from it. Enki was different in almost every way that mattered. His domain was the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, the hidden reservoir from which the Tigris and the Euphrates and every river and spring and well drew their water. In a land where reliable fresh water was the difference between life and death, the god who commanded the Abzu held a kind of power that was not political or administrative but existential, rooted in the most fundamental dependency of living things on the element that sustained them. But Enki's association with water was also an association with something deeper, with the hidden, flowing, generative quality of knowledge itself, with the way that genuine understanding moves through the cracks and gaps in the apparent solidity of things, finding its way to where it is needed, nourishing what would otherwise dry up and die. He was the god of wisdom, of clever craftsmanship, of the deep knowledge that made it possible to understand the hidden workings of the world and to use that understanding for purposes that simpler minds could not conceive. Where Enlil's authority was open and formal, announced in the assembly and enforced through explicit decree, Enki's power was more subtle, more personal, more rooted in knowledge, and in the relationships he cultivated with individual gods and humans who came to him for solutions to problems that brute authority alone could not resolve. Enki was the problem solver, the one the other gods turned to when they needed an idea that had not occurred to anyone else, the one whose understanding of the underlying structure of things went deeper than everyone else's, and whose ingenuity had a way of producing solutions that were simultaneously unexpected and, in retrospect, obviously right. He also kept the ME in his Abzu, not just as a custodial responsibility, but as a statement about where the deepest knowledge of the world actually resided, below the surface, hidden from casual inspection, accessible only to those who knew how to go deep enough to find it. In the Sumerian tradition, the ME were not abstract principles, but actual things that could be possessed, transferred, and even stolen. Enki guarded them and dispensed them as he judged appropriate. This gave him a relationship to the fundamental principles of civilization that was more intimate and more powerful than Enlil's formal role as their enforcer, because Enlil announced the order but Enki understood it, and understanding something is a different kind of power from merely governing it. The relationship between these two was fraught from the beginning. The texts know it, even when they do not say it directly. Which of them was actually more important? Enlil held formal authority. He announced the divine decrees. He ratified the kingship of human rulers. He maintained the ME and enforced the cosmic order. He was the executive power of the divine assembly. But Enki held knowledge, and knowledge, as the entire subsequent mythology demonstrates, was ultimately more generative than formal authority alone. You could govern a cosmos with authority. You could maintain order with power. But you could not create a solution to a crisis that neither authority nor power had anticipated without the kind of deep knowledge that allowed you to understand the structure of things well enough to devise something genuinely new. That asymmetry was never cleanly resolved. It was built into the structure of the divine world from the beginning, a fault line hidden beneath the surface of a hierarchy that appeared stable, and it produced a relationship between the two brothers that was simultaneously one of mutual recognition and mutual suspicion. A working partnership between two powers who needed each other, but could never fully trust each other, because the basis of their power was fundamentally incompatible. Enlil needed Enki's knowledge to govern effectively. Enki needed Enlil's formal authority to give his solutions legitimacy. And each one represented a standing challenge to the other's claim to be the most important figure in the world, a challenge that never went away no matter how many times they cooperated on shared projects. To understand how this built-in tension became the trigger for the first Anunnaki War, you need to trace it through the specific narrative the Sumerian texts provide, and that narrative begins not with a battle or a declaration of conflict, but with a labor strike. The rebellion of the Agigi is the event that set everything in motion, and the ancient scribes described it with a vividness and a specificity that suggests they understood exactly what kind of story they were telling. The Agigi were the lesser divine beings in the Sumerian cosmic hierarchy, positioned below the great Anunnaki and assigned to the physical labor of maintaining the earth. They dug the canals that controlled the flooding rivers. They cleared the riverbeds of silt that accumulated each season after the floods receded. They worked the fields that the divine agricultural system required. They built and maintained the infrastructure of a productive world, performing the labor that keeping the cosmic order operational demanded, and they did this not because they chose to, but because the hierarchy assigned it to them, and because the hierarchy had the power, or so it believed, to enforce the assignment. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete surviving accounts of the early Anunnaki mythology, describes the Agigi rebellion with a directness that suggests the ancient scribes recognized in it something familiar from human experience. The Agigi had been working for a very long time, the text says, and the work was hard and endless, and the complaint that arose among them was recognizable in its simplicity. This is too much, and it has gone on too long, and we will not continue. There is no ideological complexity in the objection, no philosophical argument about the nature of divine labor or the rights of lesser gods. Just exhaustion and refusal, the two most basic components of any labor revolt in any period of history. Their protest was not subtle. They gathered in front of the gate of Enlil's dwelling in the darkness before dawn, and they burned their tools, the baskets and the spades and the implements of their labour, in a fire that was both practical statement and symbolic act. By burning the tools, they were declaring that the work would not resume under the current terms. They surrounded Enlil's house and they would not leave. The texts say the noise of their protest was so great that Enlil himself could not sleep, that it woke him in the night, that when his advisor Nusku came to report what was happening outside, Enlil was genuinely shaken. Not because the Igigi posed a physical threat to his person, because their rebellion represented a breakdown of the cosmic order that his authority was supposed to prevent. Formal authority had been confronted with collective refusal, and it had no clean answer for it. The most politically powerful active god in the cosmos had been outmaneuvered by a labour action. So Enlil called the assembly. He summoned Anu and Enki and the great gods, and he presented the problem. The Igigi had rebelled, they would not return to work, the cosmic order required a solution. The fact that Enlil called the assembly rather than acting unilaterally is significant, and the texts present it as evidence that he was operating correctly within the framework of divine governance. When a problem exceeds the capacity of any single authority to resolve, the proper response is collective deliberation. This is what the assembly was for, and Enlil, at this stage, was doing things properly. What happened in that assembly, and particularly what Enki proposed there, is the decisive turning point the texts have been building toward. Because Enki's solution to the labour crisis was not simply clever. It was a reorganisation of the cosmos that would prove, over time, to be one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the divine world. His proposal was to create a new kind of being, made from clay and animated by divine essence, that would take over the labour the Igigi could no longer be compelled to perform. The Igigi wanted to be free of physical labour. The cosmos needed that labour to continue. The solution was to create beings capable of performing the work, without being divine enough to organise the kind of collective refusal the Igigi had mounted. Beings capable enough to think and to speak and to serve, but bounded enough by mortality and limitation that they could not accumulate the autonomous power that had allowed the Igigi to make demands. What Enki was proposing was the creation of humanity, and in proposing it, he was also proposing, perhaps without fully intending to, a reordering of the relationships within the divine world whose consequences would prove far larger than the immediate labour crisis it was designed to solve. Because the creation required Enki's knowledge. Nobody else in the divine assembly knew how to make such beings. The recipe for combining clay and divine essence in the right proportion, in the right way, to produce a creature capable of thought and labour and devotion without being capable of divine autonomy. This was Enki's knowledge alone, held in the Abzu where his deepest understanding resided. When the assembly agreed to the proposal, they agreed to a project that depended entirely on Enki's expertise, that could not proceed without his cooperation, and that would result in a creation that was, in the deepest sense, Enki's work, even if Enlil's authority had ratified it. The mother goddess Ninhursag was brought in to give the new material its proper form. The two of them worked together, mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a god slain specifically for this purpose, the blood providing the divine spark that would allow the new creatures to think and speak and serve, the clay providing the impermanence that would prevent them from accumulating the autonomous power that had allowed the Igigi to rebel. When the work was done, the first humans existed. They were placed at the service of the gods and they worked. The canals were dug, the fields were tended, the temples were staffed, the Igigi were relieved of their burden. The immediate crisis was resolved. Enlil had what he needed, a functioning world with a viable labour force. Enki had what he had made, a new kind of being that carried his design in its clay body, that owed its existence entirely to his knowledge and his craft, and toward which he felt something the texts do not name directly, but that functions in the narrative as a kind of proprietary tenderness, a protective investment in the continuation and the well-being of what he had brought into being. Not compassion in the abstract sense, something more personal than that, the feeling of a maker who cannot look at what he has made and treat it as expendable. That feeling was the first seed of the war, not the Igigi's rebellion, not the assembly's deliberation, not even the act of creation itself. The seed was the difference between how Enlil felt about the new beings and how Enki felt about them. Two gods, two relationships to the same creation, two incompatible answers waiting to be given to a question that had not yet been asked. The question arrived, as the texts describe it, through a process that was entirely natural and entirely inevitable, given what the creation of human beings actually was. Humans multiplied. This is the word the Atrahasis epic uses, and the text uses it with a precision that suggests the ancient scribes understood the significance of what they were describing. The first humans were created to solve a specific problem in a specific quantity. They were a labour force, not a population, and the difference between those two things was something the Divine Assembly had not adequately reckoned with when they approved Enki's proposal. A labour force stays the number it was created at. A population grows. Each generation produces more individuals than the generation before, and the curve of increase steepens over time until the accumulated weight of all those additional lives becomes impossible to manage from the perspective of whoever was trying to keep the world at a certain level of quiet and order. The texts describe what happened next in language that is precise and a little startling. The humans grew numerous, and they were loud. The word used for this loudness, rigmu in the Akkadian version, carries the sense of a combined clamour, the aggregate sound of many thousands of active lives being lived simultaneously, a sound that was not the sound of protest or celebration specifically, but simply the sound of the world being inhabited by a population that had grown beyond what anyone had planned for. And Enlil, the god whose sleep the Igigi had already disturbed with their deliberate protest, found that he could not sleep again. Not because the humans were doing anything wrong, not because they had transgressed the Emi or violated any divine prohibition, simply because they existed, in the numbers they now existed in, and the sound of their existence reached heaven. This detail, the detail of Enlil's disturbed sleep, is one of the most revealing in the entire mythology. It does not present Enlil as cruel or irrational. It presents him as a god with a legitimate sensitivity to disruption, who found himself in a situation where the disruption was not a violation but a consequence, an unavoidable byproduct of a solution that he himself had approved. The humans were not at fault. Enki was not at fault exactly. The fault was structural, embedded in the decision to create a reproducing labour force without any mechanism for limiting its growth. And structural faults do not respond to moral reasoning. They respond to action. Enlil acted. Without calling the assembly, without consulting Enki, without giving the god who had designed the humans any opportunity to propose an alternative, he sent a plague down to the earth, a targeted divine disease intended to reduce the human population to a level that would allow the divine world to return to its original peace. This is the moment that marks the real beginning of the conflict, and it is worth pausing on it precisely because it is so easy to rush past. The first unilateral action. The first time Enlil chose to act without the procedural consultation that had characterized his handling of the Igigi crisis. When the Igigi rebelled, he called the assembly. When the humans became too numerous, he acted alone. The distinction is not incidental. It is the hinge on which the entire subsequent conflict turns, Enki responded. Quietly, without confronting Enlil directly in the assembly, without making a public challenge to his authority, Enki went to the human beings and warned them. He told them how to appease the divine plague, what offerings to make, what prayers to send up toward the god responsible so that the dying might stop. He acted as the protector of his creation against the administrative decision of the executive authority that had ratified that creation, and he did it not by defying Enlil openly but by going around him, by using his knowledge and his relationship with humanity to counteract what Enlil's unilateral decree had set in motion. The plague receded, the humans recovered, and then they grew numerous again because nothing had changed in the fundamental structure of what they were. Reproducing beings in favourable conditions reproduce. Enlil's plague had been a temporary reduction applied to a permanent dynamic, and the permanent dynamic reasserted itself as soon as the temporary reduction lifted. A drought followed. Enki taught the humans how to manage their water supply in ways that allowed them to survive the reduction of rainfall. A famine followed. Enki found ways to nourish the population that Enlil's withdrawal of fertility had been intended to starve. Each intervention was technically not a direct violation of Enlil's decrees, because Enki was careful not to contradict what Enlil had announced in the assembly. He was simply providing the humans with knowledge that allowed them to survive what was happening to them. But the effect of each intervention was to render Enlil's decisions ineffective, to ensure that the human population survived and continued to grow, despite Enlil's repeated efforts to reduce it. What was accumulating between the two brothers through this series of incidents was not simply a policy disagreement about population management. It was something deeper and more personal, a mutual recognition that they had incompatible visions of what the world was supposed to be and what role humans were supposed to play in it, and that neither of them was willing to accept the other's vision as the definitive one. Enlil saw humans as a resource that had grown beyond the bounds of its original purpose and needed to be managed back within those bounds. Enki saw humans as a creation with its own inherent value and its own claim on the protection of the god who had made them, a claim he was not willing to abandon simply because the administrative authority of the divine world had decided that too many of them were alive. These were not administrative positions that could be reconciled through compromise. They were metaphysical positions about the nature of the relationship between divine authority and the beings that authority had called into being. Either the creation had value that persisted independently of its usefulness to the divine administration, or it did not. Either the god who had made something had an ongoing obligation to protect it, or the god who had authorized the making had the authority to authorize the unmaking as well. Both positions had their own internal logic. Neither was simply wrong in a way that argument could resolve. They were incompatible at the level of their foundational premises, and the divine world had no mechanism for resolving foundational incompatibilities except the power of each side to continue enforcing its own position until one of them ran out of the capacity to do so. The ancient scribes who pressed these stories into clay understood this. They were not describing a simple conflict between good and evil. They were describing a structural failure, a divine hierarchy that had never adequately defined what its authority was actually for, that had never drawn the line between the power to create and the power to destroy, and that was paying the price for that unresolved question, through a series of escalating crises that each left the hierarchy weaker and more internally divided than it had been before. The escalation reached its conclusion in the Assembly's decree of the Great Flood. Not another targeted plague or drought or famine, not another temporary reduction that Enki would find a way to counteract, a total inundation. The complete covering of the earth with water, the drowning of every human being alive, the return of the world to the silence that Enlil had been seeking since the moment the accumulated sound of human life had first disturbed his rest. That decision, its making, and what Enki did in response to it, is where the Cold War between the two brothers finally broke through the surface and took the form the ancient texts call war. That is where the next part of this journey begins. There is one more dimension of this early period that the texts preserve in detail, and it is a dimension that is easy to overlook in accounts focused primarily on the conflict's dramatic moments. It concerns the specific way that Enlil's repeated unilateral actions and Enki's repeated quiet interventions changed the texture of the relationship between the divine world and the human world across what must have been a very long span of time in the mythological account of the pre-flood period. Each cycle of divine plague and Enkian rescue left humanity in a slightly different position than it had been before. Not simply alive and continuing as before, but changed, marked by the experience of having been nearly destroyed and then pulled back from destruction by a force they could not fully see or understand. The humans in the Atrahasis epic are not passive in the face of what is happening to them. The texts describe them as praying, as making offerings, as attempting to understand what they have done to deserve the catastrophes that are falling on them. Their attempts to understand are genuinely moving in the context of the mythology, because the answer to their question, why is this happening to us, is not that they have sinned. They have not sinned. They have simply grown numerous and loud, and a god who did not create them has decided that their existence in the numbers they have achieved is an intolerable disruption. Their prayers are not answered by Enlil because Enlil is the one sending the disasters. They are answered, indirectly and quietly, by Enki, who teaches them what they need to know to survive without ever telling them directly what is actually going on. The humans in the mythology are navigating a divine conflict they do not know they are part of, experiencing the consequences of a disagreement between two gods about the value of their existence without having any access to the terms of that disagreement. This is another dimension of the mythology that the ancient scribes seem to have understood as genuinely true about the human condition. That human beings experience the consequences of forces they did not create and cannot fully see. That the disasters and the rescues alike have causes that extend beyond the human scale into a larger structure that human perception cannot encompass. The Sumerian answer to the human question of why bad things happen was not that bad things happen because of human sin, in the way that later religious traditions would answer it. The Sumerian answer was that bad things happen because the gods are in conflict, because the structure of the world contains an unresolved tension whose consequences fall on humans whether or not they deserve it. It is a bleaker answer than the sin and redemption framework that later traditions would develop, but in many ways it is a more honest one. Bad things do happen to people who have not sinned. The world is not organized to reward virtue and punish wickedness with anything like consistency. The Sumerian mythology names this reality and embeds it in the structure of its divine world rather than explaining it away. Enki's protection of humanity in this period, his repeated interventions to neutralize the consequences of Enlil's administrative decisions, is not presented in the texts as simply benevolent. It is also presented as something close to paternal, the protective instinct of a maker who cannot abandon what he has made, who feels the accumulated investment of creation every time a plague threatens to undo it, who keeps finding the technical space between the letter of Enlil's decrees and their intended effect and threading humanity through it. There is something almost compulsive in Enki's interventions, something that goes beyond strategic opposition to Enlil's position and into the territory of a god who simply cannot let his creation be destroyed, regardless of what the assembly has decided. This compulsion, this inability to accept the destruction of what he has made, is what will drive Enki's most dramatic action, his response to the flood decree. The assembly will vote to end the human experiment completely. The formal authority of the divine world will be deployed to do what the targeted interventions had failed to do, to ensure that the sound of human life will not reach heaven again. And Enki, bound by the assembly's decision, unable to defy it openly without destroying his own position in the divine hierarchy, will find the narrowest possible gap between the letter of the decree and its intended execution, and he will thread all of humanity through that gap on the back of a single righteous man and a single great vessel of wood sealed with bitumen against the rising water. The night is settling into real quiet now. The fan is steady. The ancient world is very far away, and also, in the way that very old stories have of being both distant and immediate, very present. The story of what happened in the assembly when the flood was decreed, and what Enki did about it, continues in the next part of tonight's journey. We left the first part of this journey at a moment of quiet dread. The divine assembly gathering to vote on whether the human experiment should end entirely, whether the water should rise over every piece of dry land on the earth and drown every living person in it, and the God who had designed and created those people sitting in that assembly, knowing what was coming, and already, somewhere in the deep structure of his being, working on what he was going to do about it. To understand what happened in that assembly, and what Enki did in response to its decision, you need to understand something about the specific nature of the authority that bound him. The divine assembly was not simply a gathering of powerful beings whose decisions happened to carry weight. It was the institutional mechanism through which the cosmic order governed itself, the body whose collective ratification gave divine actions their legitimacy, and every member of that assembly, including Enki, operated under an obligation to accept its decisions as binding, even when they disagreed with them. This was not a trivial constraint. It was the constraint that made the divine world a world rather than a chaos, that made cooperation between different divine powers possible, that prevented the cosmos from devolving into a permanent state of every god acting on his own judgment, regardless of what anyone else had decided. Enlil, when he sent his plagues and his droughts in the pre-flood period, had repeatedly violated this constraint by acting unilaterally without the assembly's sanction. His unilateral actions were one of the injuries that had been accumulating between him and Enki across the long period before the flood. But when Enlil brought the flood proposal to the assembly, when he asked the gods collectively to ratify the total destruction of the human population, he was doing things correctly. He was following the procedure he had abandoned in the earlier crises. He was bringing the decision to the body that had the authority to make it. And the assembly, presented with the evidence of repeated failed attempts to manage the human situation through lesser means, ratified it. The flood was decreed. Every human being alive would drown. The earth would return to the state it had been in before Enki had proposed his clever solution to the Agigi's labour revolt. Enki was present at the assembly when the decision was made. He had heard the debate. He knew what had been decided, and he was bound by it in the specific and limited way that the rules of the divine assembly defined. He could not openly defy the assembly's decree. He did not have the authority to annul a decision that the full council had ratified. If he acted openly to preserve humanity in direct defiance of the assembled gods, he would be doing something that went beyond his previous quiet interventions, and that constituted a challenge to the legitimacy of the divine governance system itself, a challenge that would redefine his position within that system in ways he could not fully predict or control. So Enki found the gap. The assembly had decreed the destruction of humanity. It had not, technically, forbidden Enki from speaking to the wall of a reed hut, and so, in one of the most precisely constructed moments in all of Sumerian mythology, Enki went to the dwelling of a man the Akkadian tradition calls Utnapishtim, and the earlier Sumerian version calls Ziusudra, a man described in the text as righteous and God-fearing, as worthy in a way that made him the appropriate vessel for what was about to happen. And Enki spoke not to the man but to the wall of his house. He said, in the hearing of the man on the other side of that wall, what the assembly had decided. He described what was coming, and he described, also ostensibly to the wall, what a person who happened to hear this information might do to preserve himself and his family and a representative selection of the living creatures of the earth against the flood that was coming. The cleverness of this is something the Sumerian scribes clearly relished. They describe it with the kind of narrative precision that comes from wanting the audience to appreciate exactly what is happening. Enki had not violated the letter of the assembly's decree by warning the human directly. He had not contradicted the assembly's decision by taking action to prevent the flood. He had simply spoken in the direction of information that a man with ears and intelligence would inevitably receive and act upon. The responsibility for what the man then chose to do rested, technically, with the man rather than with the god who had spoken to the wall of his house. This is recognizably a lawyer's argument, and the fact that it appears in a text 4,000 years old, embedded this precisely in the narrative, suggests that the ancient scribes were fully aware of what kind of argument it was. They were not describing a simple act of divine compassion. They were describing a god of extraordinary intelligence finding the narrowest possible space between the letter of a law and the substance of a loyalty he could not abandon, and threading himself through that space with the precision that only the deepest understanding of the law could make possible. Utnapishtim received the warning through the wall. He understood what was being communicated. He built a vessel of the specific dimensions the god had described, large enough to hold himself and his family and representatives of the living creatures of the earth, sealed with bitumen against the coming water, stocked with the provisions required to sustain life across the period of the flood. His neighbours who saw the construction were puzzled and then derisive, because the sky was clear and the rivers were running at normal levels, and there was no visible reason to build a vessel of that size in the middle of a city far from any shore. When the flood came, it came with the totality that the assembly's decree had promised. The skies opened and the rivers rose and the water covered the earth completely, drowning every city and every field and every person who was not inside the vessel that Utnapishtim had built at the direction of the god who had spoken to a wall. The noise that had kept Enlil awake for so long was suddenly, absolutely gone. The earth was water and silence, and the gods who had voted for this, who had ratified the decree in the assembly and watched the water rise from their elevated position in the divine world, found themselves confronting what a world without human beings actually felt like. The texts describe their response with a directness that is startling. They were horrified. Ninhursag, who had helped Enki create the first humans and had given them their form, wept. The gods wept. The silence that Enlil had sought for so long was real, and in the reality of it they understood, perhaps for the first time, what they had agreed to destroy. This emotional reversal is one of the most significant details in the entire mythology, and it would be easy to read it as simple sentimentality or as a narrative device designed to make the gods more sympathetic. But the texts are doing something more specific than that. They are describing the moment when the gods who had voted for the flood discovered that their decision had been based on an incomplete understanding of what humanity was. They had known humans were necessary as a labour force, as the beings who maintained the canals and staffed the temples and performed the ritual service that kept the divine world properly honoured. What they had not fully reckoned with was that humans also provided something that the gods needed in a way that was less transactional and less easily replaceable. The prayers, the offerings, the ongoing relationship of attention and devotion that connected the human world to the divine one, and that made the divine world feel inhabited rather than alone. Without humans, the gods were not simply more comfortable, they were less complete. The silence that Enlil had wanted was a silence that, in its totality, felt more like loss than relief. The divine world had been so focused on managing the costs of the human presence that it had not adequately accounted for the value of that presence, and the absence of it, when it finally arrived in the form the assembly had decreed, revealed the value by removing it. This is the kind of lesson that can only be learned in retrospect, after the thing has been lost. The gods learned it from the silence of a world underwater. When the floodwaters receded and the vessel settled on a mountain, and Utnapishtim released birds to find dry land, and eventually emerged onto solid ground and made an offering, the gods smelled the sacrificial smoke, and they gathered around it like starving people who have been without food for too long. The image is deliberate and precise. The gods surrounding the smoke of a human offering is the mythology's way of showing what the flood had actually done to the divine world, what the silence had revealed about the dependency that the gods had convinced themselves did not exist or did not matter. They needed what humans gave them. They had tried to destroy the source of what they needed, and the smoke rising from a single sacrificial fire was the first evidence that the source had not been completely destroyed after all. Enlil arrived at the offering and discovered the vessel and the survivors, and understood immediately what had happened. His anger is described in the texts with a specificity that makes it personal rather than merely administrative. He demanded to know how any human being had survived, who had broken the assembly's decree, who had given warning. He already knew the answer. There was only one god in the cosmos with the knowledge to find the gap in the assembly's decision and the motivation to use it. His accusation was directed at Enki before Enki had said anything, and the confrontation between them in the aftermath of the flood is the moment at which everything that had been accumulating in Cold War form through the plagues and the droughts and the quiet interventions finally became explicit. Enki's response was not an apology. It was not a claim that he had acted within the letter of the decree, though that claim was technically available to him. It was a direct statement of the position he had been acting on quietly through all the previous interventions, now spoken aloud in public in the assembly, with all the gods present to hear it. He said that the destruction of innocent beings was not a legitimate exercise of divine authority. He said that the assembly's decree, however formally valid, had been wrong in its substance. He said that the obligation he felt toward the beings he had created was not nullified by a majority vote in the Divine Council. And he said something further, something that the texts record as the core of his position, that a wise God does not destroy, that wisdom and destruction are incompatible at a fundamental level, and that the decision to flood the earth had been the decision of an authority that had abandoned wisdom in favor of administrative convenience. This is a remarkable statement to find in a text 4,000 years old, a statement about the limits of institutional authority, about the existence of moral obligations that are not contingent on the approval of whatever structure happens to hold formal power, about the relationship between law and justice, and the possibility that a decision can be legally valid and ethically catastrophic at the same time. The ancient Mesopotamian scribes were not writing philosophy in the abstract sense, but they were articulating through narrative something philosophically substantive that their civilization had worked out through centuries of careful theological thinking, that authority without wisdom is not the same as authority, that the power to create does not include the power to destroy without cost, and that the obligations of a maker toward what has been made are not dissolved by collective decisions about administrative convenience. Anu, the sky god, the supreme authority of the divine world, was present at this confrontation. It was Anu who mediated the aftermath, who brought the two brothers into a negotiated settlement rather than allowing the explicit conflict to escalate further. The terms of that settlement, worked out in the wake of the flood and preserved in the texts in outline if not in complete detail, established new rules for the divine-human relationship. Humans would continue to exist, but would be subject to natural mortality, which would keep their population from growing without limit in the way it had grown before. The Divine Assembly would not pursue total elimination again. Enki would operate within the Assembly's governance structure rather than around it, and a new balance would be established between the divine world's need for the human services that justified the creation and the human world's need for the divine protection that made survival possible. The settlement was real and was honoured, more or less, in the immediate aftermath of the flood, but it was also incomplete, as any settlement is when it addresses the symptoms of a conflict without addressing its cause. The cause was not the noise. The cause was not the flood. The cause was the original incompatibility between two visions of what authority was for, an incompatibility that the settlement papered over rather than resolved, and that would continue to express itself through every subsequent episode in the Anunnaki mythology, in new forms with new characters, but the same fundamental logic. The Cold War had heated briefly into open confrontation, and then cooled again into something that functioned as stability, but that carried within it, still unresolved, the same structural tension that had produced the catastrophe in the first place. The world after the flood was not the clean slate Enlil had intended. It was a world that still contained humanity, in the form of the family that had survived in the vessel, a world from which the human race would grow again, slower this time, and on different terms, but not ending. The new terms included natural death, which the gods built into the fabric of human experience as the mechanism that would keep the population from accumulating without limit in the way it had before. Humans would live and have children and die, and the cycle of generations would itself perform the limiting function that Enlil had been trying to achieve through catastrophe. Mortality was not a punishment. It was a design feature retroactively installed in the wake of a disaster that had demonstrated the consequences of its absence. But the world after the flood was also a world that carried the memory of what had happened, and that memory shaped every subsequent decision in ways that neither side fully acknowledged. For Enlil, the flood had demonstrated something he had perhaps not fully believed before, that Enki would not accept the Assembly's authority as final when it came to the fate of humanity. The Cold War he had been conducting through the plagues and the droughts, the assumption that Enki was quietly working against him through informal channels, had been confirmed in the most dramatic possible way. Enki had found a gap in the Assembly's decree and used it. He had done so cleverly enough that he could argue, with technical accuracy, that he had not violated the letter of the decision. But the substance of the violation was not in question. He had saved what the Assembly had voted to destroy. For Enki, the flood had demonstrated something equally important, that the Assembly's authority, when exercised without the constraint of wisdom, could produce decisions of catastrophic magnitude that the Assembly's own members would regret as soon as they experienced the consequences. The weeping of the gods at the offering smoke was not evidence of Enlil's cruelty. It was evidence of the Assembly's collective failure to think through what it was doing before it decreed it. The gods had voted for total destruction, without adequately reckoning with what total destruction would cost them, and the cost had been revealed in the first moment of the silence that followed. This meant that the Assembly's authority was not simply wrong when misused. It was capable of producing outcomes that were wrong in ways the Assembly itself would acknowledge, which meant that the obligation to resist those outcomes was not simply Enki's personal preference, but something closer to a duty. These two lessons, Enlil's conviction that Enki would not respect the Assembly's authority when it came to humanity, and Enki's conviction that the Assembly's authority had demonstrated its capacity for catastrophic misjudgment, were not reconciled by the post-flood settlement. They were contained by it, managed to a level that allowed the divine will to function, but not resolved. The underlying incompatibility remained, as it had always remained, as a permanent feature of the divine world structure. The specific way this remaining incompatibility expressed itself in the post-flood period involved the question of what kind of world humanity was supposed to build, and more particularly, the question of what knowledge humans were supposed to have access to. This is a dimension of the mythology that sometimes gets lost in the focus on the flood narrative, but that the Sumerian texts treat as equally significant, and that is in many ways more revealing about the deep nature of the conflict between the two brothers. The Emi, the divine organizing principles of civilization, were held in Enki's Absu. They were his to guard and dispense. The question of how freely they should be distributed to the human world was a question on which Enlil and Enki disagreed in ways that reflected their broader disagreement about the nature and purpose of humanity. Enlil's position was that humans should have access to the Emi that they needed to perform their assigned functions and no more. The Emi of basic agriculture and craft and temple service were appropriate for humans to possess. The Emi of deeper knowledge, of the kinds of wisdom and capability that would allow humans to develop autonomy from divine oversight, to build power structures that did not depend on divine sanction. These were, in Enlil's view, dangerous. Giving humans access to that level of knowledge was giving them tools to become something more than servants, and the whole point of creating humans had been to produce effective servants. Enki's position was characteristically different. He had created humans with divine blood in their composition, with a genuine capacity for intelligence and understanding that went beyond the minimum required for servile labour, and he believed that this capacity was not accidental, but intentional. The humans he had made were capable of more than Enlil's administrative vision allowed for, and withholding from them the knowledge that their capabilities entitled them to access was a kind of ongoing injustice, a perpetual limitation imposed by administrative convenience on beings whose nature qualified them for more. The most dramatic expression of this disagreement appears in the story of the goddess Inanna and the Emi. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, visited Enki's Abzu and acquired the Emi from him through a combination of flattery and divine drink and strategic timing. The texts describe Enki's reaction when he understood what had happened with the kind of mixture of admiration and frustration that suggests he recognized in her action a version of his own characteristic approach, finding the gap between what the rules prohibited and what they technically allowed and threading herself through it before anyone had time to object. He sent messengers after her to retrieve what she had taken, but she had already distributed the Emi to the city of Uruk, where they became the foundation of an explosion of civilizational development that the texts associate with the flowering of Sumerian urban culture. The knowledge was out. It was in the human world. And even Enki, who had made the distribution possible through his own lack of caution in the divine feast Inanna had arranged, could not bring it back. Enlil's response was predictable. The humans had too much again. The balance had been tilted in a direction that threatened the cosmic order. Something had to be done. But the distribution of the Emi had changed the terms of the argument permanently. Humans who possessed the full range of civilizational principles were not the simple servants of divine administrative convenience that Enlil had envisioned. They were something more, and the divine world had to figure out how to govern a relationship with a humanity that was developing its own complexity in ways that the original design had not anticipated. This is the dynamic that the post-flood Mesopotamian civilization inhabited. A world where the human population possessed more knowledge than Enlil had intended them to have, where the divine conflict that had produced the flood was not resolved but managed, where the two brothers continued to hold their incompatible positions on the nature and purpose of humanity, and continued to express those positions through the specific decisions they made about specific human cities and specific human kings. The people living in those cities and governed by those kings experienced the ongoing conflict as the variable fortune of their civilizations, as the unpredictable movement of divine favour and divine displeasure that the Sumerian king list and the mythological tradition tried to make sense of by tracing it back to decisions made in the divine assembly. The ancient scribes who maintained the temple libraries of Sumer, who copied and preserved the myths and hymns and king lists that constituted the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization, understood their work as participating in this larger divine drama. They were not simply recording history, they were maintaining the knowledge that allowed the human world to understand its relationship to the divine world, to navigate the space between the two competing visions of divine authority with enough clarity to make informed decisions about how to conduct individual and communal life. To see the real trigger of the First Anunnaki War most clearly, it is necessary to read the Atrahasis epic not as a simple flood story, but as a document that encodes across its 3 surviving tablets a complete account of how the divine world moved from its original stable configuration to the point of near-total catastrophe, and how the mechanism of that movement was not any individual act of transgression, but a structural failure embedded in the world's original design. The first tablet establishes the pre-human cosmos with a clarity that makes the subsequent breakdown all the more striking. The world is organized. Each divine being has its place. The work of maintaining the cosmos is distributed according to rank, with the Igigi performing the physical labor and the great Anunnaki overseeing the cosmic order from their elevated positions. Everything is, in the technical sense, functioning. But the text's language in describing this functioning carries undertones of fragility, of a system maintained by the compliance of those subject to it, rather than by any inherent stability in the system itself. The Igigi are working, but the work is described as hard and the time of performing it is described as long, and the ancient scribes' insistence on these details is a signal that the functioning order is one that depends on the continued willingness of those performing the work to keep performing it. When that willingness fails, when the Igigi burn their tools and surround Enlil's house, the text language shifts to describe Enlil's response with a specificity that reveals what kind of leader he is in a crisis. a leader who summons the assembly, who follows the proper procedure, who brings the crisis to the collective rather than attempting to manage it alone. This procedural correctness is presented as a genuine virtue in the text, but it has a shadow. The procedural correctness means that the solution to the crisis will depend on whoever in the assembly has the most useful idea, and the most useful idea belongs to the brother whose domain and whose knowledge the assembly cannot function without. The first time Enlil follows procedure, he inadvertently creates the conditions for the entire subsequent conflict by giving Enki the opportunity to propose a solution that will embed Enki's values and Enki's loyalties into the very fabric of the new cosmic order. The second tablet is where the human population problem develops and where the first escalations of the conflict become visible. The tablet describes the multiplication of humanity in language calibrated to evoke the inexorable quality of exponential growth. Not simply an increase, but a compounding, each generation producing more individuals than the last. The curve of increase steepening over time until the accumulated weight becomes impossible to ignore. And then the text presents Enlil's response, and here the language becomes the most revealing element in the document. Enlil decided. Not Enlil consulted, not Enlil assembled. Enlil decided, and then he acted. The unilateral quality of the decision is embedded in the grammar, in the solitary subject performing the action, without the procedural consultation that had characterized his handling of the Igigi crisis. This is the trigger, not the noise, not the flood. The trigger was the first moment when Enlil chose to bypass the assembly's procedure in handling the human population problem, because that choice established a precedent that the human question was a matter to be handled unilaterally by whoever had the relevant authority, and Enki's response established the counter-precedent that unilateral decisions in the human domain would be met with unilateral counteraction. Once both precedents were established, the assembly's ability to govern the conflict was permanently compromised. The system designed to manage incompatible views through collective deliberation had been superseded by a bilateral power struggle that the system's own procedures were no longer capable of containing. The third tablet is where that power struggle reaches its logical conclusion and where the post-war settlement is negotiated, imperfect and incomplete as all settlements are when they address symptoms rather than causes. But the settlement is also where the mythology makes its most direct statement about what the conflict had been about all along, because the terms of the settlement are not terms about population management or divine administrative convenience. They are terms about the relationship between authority and obligation, about what the divine world owes to what it has created, about where the limits of legitimate authority actually fall. Enki's statement in the aftermath of the flood, his direct articulation of the position he had been acting on quietly through all the previous interventions, is the mythology's clearest expression of its central theological claim. Wise gods do not destroy. Wisdom and destruction are incompatible at a fundamental level. Authority exercised without wisdom is not authority in the full sense, but only power, and power without wisdom produces the outcome the flood had demonstrated: the destruction of something whose value the destroyers recognized only in the silence of its absence. This claim is the theological core of the first Anunnaki War, and the answer to the question of what triggered it. The trigger was not the noise, and not the plagues, and not the flood. The trigger was the original failure of the divine world to resolve the incompatibility between formal authority and generative knowledge, a failure that was built into the cosmos from the moment Anu divided it among his sons, and gave one son the power to govern, and the other son the knowledge to create without establishing any clear principle for resolving the conflicts that would inevitably arise between governing and creating. The war was triggered before it began, in the structure of the world, in the unresolved tension at the heart of the divine hierarchy's design. The ancient scribes who preserved these texts across 4,000 years understood this. They understood that they were not recording a story about individual gods making individual mistakes. They were recording a structural analysis embedded in narrative form, an account of how the incompatibility between two principles of governance produces catastrophe when it is allowed to accumulate without resolution. And they preserved it not as a curiosity or an entertainment, but as the most important piece of knowledge their civilization possessed: the knowledge of how the world was organized and what kinds of failure that organization made inevitable, and what could be done within the genuine limits of human agency to navigate the space between those failures wisely. There is a specific passage in the surviving text of the Atrahasis epic that crystallizes the theological position of the entire mythology in a way that is easy to miss on a first reading, but that becomes unmistakable once you have traced the full arc of the conflict. It comes in the aftermath of the flood, in the negotiation between the divine factions mediated by Anu, and it is a statement not about the specific terms of the post-flood settlement, but about the principle that the settlement is meant to embody. Anu says, in the version of the text that has survived most completely, that the assembly had not adequately thought through what it was doing when it decreed the flood, that the decision had been made in frustration rather than in wisdom, and that frustration and wisdom are not the same thing and do not produce the same outcomes. This is a remarkable moment of divine self-criticism embedded in a 4,000-year-old religious document. The supreme authority of the divine world is acknowledging, in the presence of the full assembly, that the assembly made a catastrophically bad decision. Not because the decision was procedurally improper. It was procedurally proper. It was brought to the assembly, it was debated, it was ratified by the appropriate collective body. The decision was bad not in its procedure but in its substance, in the quality of thinking that produced it, in the failure of the assembled gods to exercise the wisdom that legitimate authority requires. This acknowledgement, placed in the mouth of Anu himself, the supreme divine authority, is the mythology's way of saying that the first Anunnaki war was triggered not by Enki's defiance of legitimate authority, but by legitimate authority's abandonment of wisdom. Enlil was not wrong to bring the flood proposal to the assembly. The assembly was not wrong to follow its procedures. What was wrong was the thinking behind the decision, the failure to reckon with the full implications of what was being decreed, the administrative convenience that overrode the deeper understanding of what the relationship between the divine and human worlds actually was. And in placing the acknowledgement of that failure in Anu's voice rather than Enki's, the mythology is locating the error not in the rebel but in the institution, not in the god who defied the decree but in the gods who made it. The ancient Mesopotamians who heard these stories and copied them and preserved them across the centuries of their civilization's existence were not simply absorbing religious entertainment. They were absorbing a political education, a sophisticated and honest account of how institutional authority fails, of what distinguishes legitimate governance from the exercise of raw administrative power, and of what the consequences are when the distinction is lost. They lived in a world governed by kings and priests who made decisions with real consequences for real people, and the mythology gave them a framework for evaluating those decisions that was honest enough to acknowledge when the authorities were wrong and sophisticated enough to explain why they were wrong rather than simply noting that they were. The Sumerian lament texts, the poems composed in the aftermath of historical catastrophes when cities fell to invading armies and divine patronage was perceived to have been withdrawn, are one of the most direct expressions in the broader literature of what the post-flood settlement actually meant for daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. These texts, which describe the abandonment of cities by their divine protectors in language that is simultaneously precise and heartbreaking, process historical disasters through the theological framework of the Enlil-Enki conflict, in ways that reveal how that conflict was experienced by ordinary people rather than by divine beings in a cosmic assembly. When the text known as the Lament for the Destruction of Ur describes Enlil decreeing the city's destruction, it uses language that is specific about the mechanism. The divine assembly decided, the decree was announced, the protection was withdrawn, the walls fell. This is Enlil's logic operating in the historical register, the administrative management of divine favour and its withdrawal that is the practical expression of his vision of how the divine-human relationship works. Cities exist under divine protection when they are useful to the divine world and when they maintain their obligations to it. When the assessment changes, the protection is withdrawn. But the lament texts also preserve in their very form as expressions of grief rather than as simple administrative records of a change in divine favour, the counter-principle that Enki had always represented. The act of lamenting is itself a statement that what has been lost had value beyond its administrative function, that the destruction deserves to be mourned rather than simply noted, that the city and the people and the accumulated human achievement it contained are not simply resources whose loss is a neutral fact. Every lament text is implicitly an argument against the purely administrative view of human civilization, an insistence that what has been made matters and that its loss matters, regardless of what the divine assembly decided about the cost-benefit analysis of its continued protection. The scribes who composed and preserved the lament texts were doing in the literary register exactly what Enki had done in the narrative register. maintaining the value of creation against the administrative logic of those who see creation primarily as a resource, and they were doing it at personal cost, in the aftermath of genuine catastrophes that had destroyed the cities and the libraries and the institutional frameworks that had made their own work possible. The preservation of the lament is itself an act of resistance to the silence that destruction produces. It is the insistence that the story continues even when the city has fallen, that the human capacity for meaning-making survives the loss of the specific cultural forms in which that meaning had been expressed. This is the deepest legacy of the first Anunnaki War as the Sumerian tradition preserved it. Not a theological curiosity or a mythological entertainment, but a framework for understanding the permanent tension between the forces that manage and the forces that make, between the authority that governs and the creativity that creates, and for living within that tension with the honesty and the courage that genuine understanding requires. The ancient scribes who pressed these stories into clay were giving their civilization, and through the accidents of preservation giving us as well, the most honest account they could produce of the world as it actually was. Not as they wished it were, not as they hoped it would become, as it was with all the difficulty and all the beauty that the actual world contains. Rest now. The ancient voices have said what they came to say in this part of the journey. The night is ready to carry you forward. The Gilgamesh epic is the most famous piece of literature to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, and it is also, in ways that are not always recognized, the most personal statement about what the first Anunnaki War cost the human world. The story of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, and who spent the second half of his narrative life trying to escape the mortality that the human third imposed on him, is the story of what it feels like to live in a world shaped by the conflict between Enlil and Enki. Not the cosmic version of that conflict, not the divine assembly and the flood decree and the reed hut warning, but the personal version. The experience of being a being made of both divine spark and earthly clay, capable enough to understand what death means and what it costs, but not capable enough to avoid paying that cost. The grief that drives Gilgamesh is grief over the death of his companion Enkidu. Enkidu was killed by the gods as a consequence of the hero's transgression against the divine order, their killing of the bull of heaven, and their disrespect toward the goddess Ishtar. The divine assembly decreed that one of the companions must die for what they had done, and it was Enkidu, the more earthly of the two, who was chosen. The divine logic is recognizable as Enlil's logic. Transgression against the cosmic order requires correction, and the correction takes the form of mortal consequence applied to the mortal member of the pair. The assembly decided. The decree was announced. Enkidu died. Gilgamesh's response to this is the response of a being who has been given, through the divine blood in his composition, exactly enough understanding to grasp the full horror of mortality and not enough divine nature to be exempt from it. He grieves with an intensity the texts describe as almost pathological, refusing to accept what has happened, circling the body of his dead companion for 7 days before the reality of the loss forces itself on him. And then he sets out on the quest that defines the second half of the narrative, the search for the secret of immortality, the determination to find the one thing that would allow him to escape the condition that Enkidu's death has made intolerable. The path of that quest leads him eventually to Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, the man whom Enki had warned through the wall of the reed hut, and who had been granted immortality by the gods as a reward for his survival and his faithfulness. Utnapishtim lives at the edge of the world, past the waters of death, in a place that no ordinary mortal can reach. The fact that Gilgamesh reaches him anyway is itself a testament to the extraordinary quality of the king, to the divine component of his nature that makes him capable of feats no purely human being could achieve. But Utnapishtim does not give Gilgamesh what he is looking for. He tells him the story of the flood, which is the mythology's way of encoding the full weight of the Enlil-Enki conflict within the Gilgamesh narrative, of making explicit the connection between the personal quest for immortality and the cosmic conflict about the nature of human existence. He tells Gilgamesh about the plant of eternal youth that grows at the bottom of the sea, a piece of hidden knowledge about a natural resource with divine properties that is recognizably the kind of knowledge that resides in the Abzu, in the deep underwater domain where Enki's wisdom is stored. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea and retrieves the plant. He holds in his hands the answer to the question that has driven his entire quest, and then he falls asleep on the journey home, and a serpent steals the plant while he sleeps, and he returns to Uruk empty-handed. The resolution of the Gilgamesh epic is not the acquisition of divine status by a remarkable human being. It is the acceptance of mortality by someone who has done everything possible to escape it and has failed. The acceptance is not defeat in the sense that yields to despair. It is something more like maturity, the hard-won recognition that what makes human existence meaningful is not its duration but its quality, not the escape from death, but the full use of the life available before death arrives. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and looks at the walls he has built, the city he has made, the human achievement that will outlast his individual life, and in that looking finds something that is not immortality, but is the closest thing to it that the human world offers: the permanence of what has been made, the endurance of the work, the survival of the creation after the creator is gone. This resolution is a direct statement of Enki's theological position, expressed through the life of a human being rather than through the deliberations of a divine assembly. The humans that Enki created are not going to become gods. They are not going to escape the mortality that the clay component of their creation imposed on them, but they are also not going to be reduced to the simple servants of divine administrative convenience that Enlil had wanted them to remain. They are going to be what Gilgamesh is: beings of extraordinary capability and genuine limitation, creators of things that endure past their own death, participants in a world that is worth being part of even though it ends. They are going to be, in the most precise and honest sense, human. The Gilgamesh epic is the mythology's answer to the question that the first Anunnaki war raised about the nature of humanity. Enlil had wanted to destroy them because they were too much. Enki had protected them because they were his creation. The epic says that they are neither simply too much, nor simply worth protecting for proprietary reasons. They are the beings made at the intersection of the divine and the earthly, capable of understanding what they cannot have, able to make meaning from the limitations they cannot escape, and possessed of a creative capacity that produces things of genuine value even within the constraints of mortal time. This is a more complex answer than either brother's position in the divine assembly, and it is the answer the mythology ultimately settles on as the truth of what humanity is. The physical record that the ancient Mesopotamians left of this mythology is extraordinary in its own right. The clay tablets on which the stories were preserved are not simply containers for the stories. They are themselves evidence of the values the mythology expresses, because the choice to press words into clay rather than into more perishable materials is a choice about what deserves to last. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia understood that they were working in one of the most durable media available to them, that the tablets they produced would outlast the buildings they were stored in, and the cities those buildings stood in, and the civilizations those cities embodied. The decision to encode the most important stories in that medium was a decision about permanence, a statement that what was being recorded was worth the effort to make it last. When the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia were destroyed, the tablets did not burn the way papyrus or parchment burns. They baked harder. The fires that destroyed the physical structures that housed the libraries inadvertently preserved the contents of those libraries in a more robust form than they had existed before the destruction. The great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, sacked by the Babylonians and their allies in 612 BCE, yielded thousands of clay tablets when it was excavated by archaeologists in the 19th century, tablets whose contents had been fixed by the very fire that had destroyed the building containing them. The destruction that was intended to end the tradition instead preserved it, in a form that has survived to the present. There is something in this detail that resonates with the mythology itself, with the story of the flood that was intended to destroy humanity, but instead produced a survivor who carried the seeds of the human future in a vessel sealed against the water. The parallel is not a coincidence. The ancient Mesopotamians understood survival as something that happens, not because destruction fails, but because something essential is carried through the destruction in a protected form, and the physical survival of the clay tablets through fire is a version of the same pattern that their most important story described. The texts that record the survival of Utnapishtim through the flood survived the floods and fires of history in the way the texts themselves say that living things survive catastrophe, by being made of the right material, sealed against the hostile medium, carried by something more durable than the structures that the catastrophe destroyed. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic that was recited on the fourth day of the New Year festival in ancient Babylon, and that served as the foundational theological document of the Babylonian state, represents the most ambitious reworking of the Sumerian mythological tradition, and the one that most clearly reveals how the Enlil-Enki conflict was understood to have transformed over time. In the Enuma Elish, the central divine conflict is not between Enlil and Enki, but between Tiamat, the primordial salt water, and a new cosmic order represented by the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. But if you read the Enuma Elish alongside the earlier Sumerian sources, the continuity is unmistakable. Marduk is Enki's son in the divine genealogy, and the texts make this explicit. The wisdom and the creative power that Marduk brings to the defeat of Tiamat and the organization of the new cosmic order are presented as gifts from his father. The inheritance of Enki's knowledge, now deployed by a younger generation in a world that the older conflict had left unstable, is the mechanism through which the Babylonian tradition connects its present to its past. Marduk does what Enki always did. He solves the crisis that the older divine authority cannot solve. He uses his knowledge to create where the older authority could only manage, and he establishes a new order that reflects the generative principle, rather than simply reasserting the administrative one. The Babylonian tradition's elevation of Marduk to the supreme position in the divine hierarchy, a position that Enlil had previously occupied, is a theological statement about the resolution of the Enlil-Enki conflict. It is not that Enki wins and Enlil loses in some simple sense. It is that the world evolves, over the long span of divine time, in the direction that the generative principle points, toward a cosmos that is increasingly organized around the value of creation rather than the maintenance of a fixed order, toward a divine world in which the ability to make new things in response to new situations is recognized as more fundamental than the authority to govern the things that already exist. Enlil does not disappear in this transition. He retains his position in the divine hierarchy. He continues to be honored in the temples of Babylon alongside the newer gods. But the center of gravity has shifted, and that shift reflects a genuine theological development in Mesopotamian thought over the centuries between the earliest Sumerian sources and the Babylonian texts, a development toward the recognition that creative capacity is the more fundamental divine attribute, that the world is better governed by those who understand it deeply enough to respond to its changing situations than by those who govern it according to fixed principles applied without wisdom. This development is visible in the specific language the Enuma Elish uses to describe Marduk's qualifications for the supreme position. He is praised not primarily for his authority or his strength, though he has both, but for his wisdom, for his understanding of the deep structure of things, for his capacity to devise solutions that the older generation of gods could not imagine. These are exactly the qualities the earlier mythology associated with Enki, and the inheritance is explicit in the genealogy. Marduk is what Enki's wisdom produces when it is given full authority, rather than being forced to operate through the gaps in an authority structure controlled by someone else. The political dimension of this theological development is not incidental. The elevation of Marduk in the Babylonian tradition reflected the political reality that Babylon had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia, and Marduk's theological promotion reflected and reinforced Babylon's political dominance. But the theological content of the promotion was not simply invented for political convenience. It was drawn from a tradition of thinking about divine authority that had been developing in the Sumerian and Akkadian world for centuries, a tradition that had been working through, in mythological narrative form, the same questions about the relationship between formal authority and creative wisdom that the Enlil-Enki conflict had first posed. The human beings living in the Babylon of the early 2nd millennium BCE, in the period when the Enuma Elish was being composed in the form in which we have it, were the inheritors of 3,000 years of this tradition. They had been told, in the most durable form their civilization knew how to use, that the world was organized around a conflict between incompatible principles, that the resolution of that conflict was never simple or final, and that the appropriate human response to living in a world shaped by such a conflict was not despair, but the cultivation of wisdom, the kind of wisdom that Enki embodied and that Marduk inherited, the understanding deep enough to find the solution that the situation actually requires, rather than the solution that the existing authority structure most conveniently provides. This is the message the clay tablets carried across 4,000 years, not the simple message that the good guys win, not the reassuring message that the divine world is organized for human benefit, the honest message that the world is complex, that the forces that shape it are real and incompatible and permanently in tension, and that human beings who want to navigate that world well need exactly the kind of understanding that the Sumerian scribal tradition was designed to transmit: clear-eyed, honest, unafraid of complexity, committed to the value of creation even in the face of the forces that would manage it out of existence. The king lists of ancient Sumer are another layer of the same tradition, and they reveal something about how the post-flood world organized its understanding of divine-human relations in ways that connect directly to the conflict we have been tracing. The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest surviving historical documents in the world, a clay tablet or series of tablets that records the names and reign lengths of the kings of Sumer from what the text describes as the moment when kingship first descended from heaven to the moment of its composition. The list begins with impossibly long reign lengths, individual kings said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years, and then, after the flood, the reigns become shorter and more recognisably human, with lengths that correspond much more closely to actual historical periods. This transition, from the antediluvian period of impossibly long reigns to the post-flood period of historical human kingship, is the king list's way of encoding the theological change that the flood produced in the relationship between the divine and human worlds. Before the flood, the text implies, the boundary between divine time and human time was different, more permeable, organised according to a different logic. After the flood, human time became what we recognise as human time, finite, measured in decades rather than millennia, subject to the same mortality that the post-flood settlement had installed as the mechanism for limiting the human population. The movement of kingship from city to city in the post-flood portion of the king list also reflects the ongoing conflict between the divine factions. When Enlil's favour was with a city, its king ruled and the city prospered. When Enlil's favour was withdrawn, the city fell and the kingship moved to the next city that had divine sanction. The cities associated with Enki's patronage, particularly Eridu, the oldest and most sacred city in the Sumerian tradition, appear in the list with a reverence that suggests the ancient scribes understood Eridu's significance as Enki's city even when they were recording the political dominance of other centres. The sacred geography of the Sumerian world, the distribution of divine patronage across the landscape of the plain, was itself a map of the ongoing conflict between the two brothers, expressed not in the dramatic narrative form of the mythological texts, but in the dry administrative form of a list of kings and cities and reign lengths. The scribes who maintained the king list understood themselves as participants in the same tradition as the scribes who copied the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh cycle. They were preserving different kinds of knowledge about the same reality. The mythological scribes preserving the theological understanding of how the divine world worked, the administrative scribes preserving the historical record of how that divine world's decisions played out in the human one. Both kinds of preservation were understood as essential to the civilization's ability to understand itself and to navigate the world that the divine conflict had shaped. When Babylon rose to dominance in the early 2nd millennium BCE and produced the Enuma Elish, and the most complete surviving version of the Gilgamesh epic and the Atrahasis, the city was not simply accumulating literary prestige, it was performing the function that every dominant civilization performs, gathering into itself the accumulated intellectual heritage of the tradition it was inheriting, and giving that heritage new form, new emphasis, new relevance to the specific conditions of the new moment. The Babylonian versions of the Sumerian myths are not simply translations or reprints. They are interpretations, works that take the inherited material and reshape it to reflect the theological and political understanding of a civilization that had thought more carefully about what the material meant than any of its predecessors had. What the Babylonian versions emphasize, consistently and unmistakably, is the resolution of the Enlil-Enki conflict in the direction that Enki's vision had always pointed, toward a world in which creative wisdom is the most important form of divine power, in which the ability to make new things in response to new situations is valued above the authority to maintain fixed order, and in which human beings, the creation that the conflict had been about, are understood as the beneficiaries and the expressions of the creative principle that Enki had always embodied. The ancient Mesopotamian tradition produced, over its 3,000 years of development, one of the most honest and one of the most sophisticated understandings of the human condition in all of ancient literature. It does not promise salvation or transcendence. It does not claim that the divine world is organized for human benefit. It says that humans are the product of a divine conflict between two visions, that they carry within them both the divine spark that makes them capable of greatness and the earthly limitation that ensures they will die, and that the appropriate response to this condition is not despair, but the full use of the capability they have been given, for as long as they have it, to make and build and maintain something worth having been part of. The scribal tradition of ancient Mesopotamia was not simply an intellectual enterprise. It was a physical one, and the physicality of it matters for understanding why the tradition was preserved with the care that it was. The Aduba, the tablet house, was a place of training that began in childhood and continued through adolescence, and the central activity of that training was copying. Not reading, not discussing, not analysing, copying. The physical act of pressing cuneiform signs into clay day after day, season after season, until the hand knew the signs so well that the copying could proceed without conscious attention to the individual marks, until the texts had been absorbed through the hand as much as through the eye and the mind. This method of learning through physical repetition created a relationship between the scribes and the texts they copied that was different from any relationship that purely intellectual engagement produces. The texts were not simply known in the way that a person knows information they have read and retained. They were known in the way that a musician knows a piece of music after years of practice, in the body, in the automatic responses that the long training had installed, in a form of knowing that was not separate from the physical process through which it had been acquired. The ancient Mesopotamian scribes did not simply know the Atrahasis epic the way a modern scholar knows it. They knew it the way they knew how to breathe, as something that had become part of the automatic infrastructure of their being. This kind of knowing produces a different relationship to preservation. When a scribe copied the Atrahasis epic for the 100th time, the act was not simply the transmission of information from one medium to another. It was a renewal of the tradition, a reperformance of the chain of transmission that connected the current scribe to every scribe who had copied the text before him, a physical enactment of the commitment to continuity that the entire scribal tradition was built around. The text survived not because any single scribe made a deliberate decision to preserve it, but because thousands of scribes across centuries made the practical decision to keep copying it, to include it in the curriculum of the tablet houses, to teach it to their students, to ensure that the chain of transmission did not break. That chain did eventually break, or more precisely, it was broken by the historical catastrophes that destroyed the civilizations that had maintained it. When Alexander's armies and their successors transformed the political landscape of the ancient Near East, in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, the Babylonian scribal tradition did not survive intact into the Hellenistic world. The last cuneiform tablets were written sometime in the 1st century CE, and after that the tradition that had stretched unbroken from the earlier Sumerian scribes was gone, preserved only in the tablets that had been buried in the ruins of the libraries and temples that had housed the tradition. But the tablets survived. That is the fact that everything else depends on. The clay survived when everything else, the mud brick buildings, the wooden furniture, the reed mats, the organic materials of daily life had long since dissolved, or rotted, or been destroyed. The clay tablets lay in the soil for 2,000 years, waiting for the archaeologists who would eventually dig them up, and the cuneiformists who would eventually read them, and the translators who would eventually bring them back into living language. The chain of transmission that the fall of Babylon had broken was reconnected by archaeology and scholarship, and the understanding that the ancient scribes had pressed into clay in the lamplight of temple complexes more than 4,000 years ago was restored to the world that it had been waiting to rejoin. What that understanding says, when you have traced it through the structure of the conflict that produced it, is something that remains true about the world regardless of the specific mythological framework in which it was first expressed. The tension between authority and creation, between the principle that manages and the principle that makes, between formal governance and generative wisdom, is not a Sumerian discovery that applies only to ancient Mesopotamia. It is a feature of any complex system that contains both the need for order and the capacity for creation, which is every complex system that is worth having. The Sumerians were the first civilization to articulate this tension clearly enough and durably enough that their articulation has survived to be read now. But the tension they were articulating was not their invention. It existed before them, and it exists still, and the civilization that best understands it is the civilization that is best equipped to navigate it without the catastrophes that the failure to understand it produces. There is a hymn to Enki that survives from the Sumerian tradition, one of the oldest complete religious poems in the world, that describes the god moving through the cities of Sumer and bestowing on each city the specific gifts that would make it flourish. Eridu receives the deep waters, Nippur receives the wind and the storm, receives the moon and the harbour, Meluha receives the sea routes and the exotic goods that come from distant lands. The hymn is an account of divine generosity as the organising principle of the world, of the god of wisdom moving through the human landscape and giving each community what it needs to become what it is capable of becoming. The theology expressed in this hymn is precisely Enki's theology, as the mythology defines it. The world as an expression of creative generosity, each community receiving the gifts that its specific nature and situation require, diversity and particularity valued rather than managed into uniformity. This is the opposite of Enlil's vision, in which the world is organised around a uniform order maintained by the same principles applied consistently everywhere. Enki's world is full of different cities with different gifts and different characters. Enlil's world is a world in which the same ME apply everywhere, and the same standards of cosmic order are enforced regardless of the specific circumstances of any particular community. The hymn to Enki is not a political manifesto. It is a piece of devotional literature composed to be sung in the temples of Eridu by priests who wanted to honour the god of wisdom and to celebrate his gifts. But the theological content of what it celebrates is not neutral. It is an affirmation of the value of diversity, of creative generosity, of the principle that the right response to different situations is different responses rather than the uniform application of universal rules. This is Enki's vision expressed in its most positive and most beautiful form, and the fact that it was preserved and sung in the temples of ancient Sumer is evidence that the Sumerian tradition valued this vision, alongside the more formal theological accounts of the divine conflict that the mythological text preserved. The world that the Sumerian tradition described and that the Mesopotamian civilizations inhabited for 3,000 years was a world in which both principles were present and both were honoured, in which the temples of Enlil and the temples of Enki stood in the same cities and were served by the same scribal traditions and maintained by the same institutional infrastructure. The conflict between the two principles was real, and its consequences were catastrophic when the conflict was allowed to escalate without management. But the coexistence of the two principles was also real, and their coexistence was what made the Sumerian world complex enough and rich enough to produce the literature and the theology and the administrative sophistication that we associate with the first great civilizations of human history. The night is at its deepest now. The fan turns with a patience that matches the patience of the ancient texts, which waited in the soil for 2,000 years to be found and read again. What you have heard tonight is a small part of what those texts contain, but it is the heart of what they were trying to say, that the world is organized by a tension between incompatible principles, that this tension is permanent and real, that human beings exist in the space it creates, and that living well in that space requires exactly the kind of clear-eyed, honest, complexity-embracing wisdom that the Sumerian scribal tradition spent 3,000 years trying to transmit. The city lament texts of ancient Sumer, the poems composed in the aftermath of urban catastrophes, when cities fell to invading armies and divine patronage was perceived to have been withdrawn, represent one of the most moving bodies of literature in the ancient world, and one of the clearest expressions of the Enlil-Enki theology in its practical application to historical events. These texts describe the abandonment of cities by their divine patrons in language that is specific and precise and devastating. The god decides to leave, the divine protection is withdrawn, the walls fall, the people are killed or scattered, the temple is burned, and the city that had been the centre of a living community becomes rubble and silence. The specific language of divine abandonment in these texts is recognisably Enlil's language. The decision is administrative. The divine assembly assessed the situation, the decree was announced, the protection was withdrawn. The humans who suffered the consequences of this administrative decision are not described as having done anything to deserve it. The city of in the most famous of the lament texts, is described as innocent, as having maintained its obligations to the divine world, as having done what was expected of it. The catastrophe that fell on it was not punishment for transgression. It was the consequence of divine administrative decision. of the assembly's judgment that the time of the city's divine protection had ended. And the lament text grieves, "This is the detail that is most important and most distinctive about the lament genre. It does not simply record the catastrophe, it mourns it. It insists on the grief that the catastrophe deserves. It maintains, in the face of the divine assembly's decision that the city's time was over, that what was lost had value, that the divine administration's assessment cannot fully capture, that the people and the buildings and the cultural heritage that the destruction consumed are not simply resources whose loss is a neutral fact, but creations whose absence is a real diminishment of the world." This insistence on the value of what has been lost is Enki's principle expressed through the form of a poem. The same God who could not accept the administrative elimination of humanity in the flood narrative is present in the lament tradition in the form of the grief itself, in the refusal to treat the destruction of cities as simply the consequence of divine decisions that are beyond human comment or mourning. The lament tradition is the literary equivalent of Enki's interventions in the mythological narrative, the insistence that creation has value, that persists even when authority has decreed otherwise, that loss is real and grief is appropriate, and what has been made deserves to be mourned when it is unmade. The scribes who composed the lament texts, and the scribes who preserved them and copied them into the tablets that have survived to our time, were doing both things simultaneously, acknowledging the reality of the world that Enlil's logic produces, and asserting the value of what that world destroys. They were living in the space between the two divine principles as humans have always lived in that space, and doing what humans do in that space, making meaning from the tension, finding in the grief itself a form of affirmation, preserving in the act of mourning the value of what the mourning acknowledges as lost. That is the final thing the ancient scribes were trying to transmit, and it is the thing that has travelled most completely across the 4,000 years between their writing and this telling. Not theological doctrine or mythological narrative or administrative record, the understanding that living things have value, that their loss matters, and that the appropriate response to genuine loss is genuine grief, honest, full, unashamed. The willingness to mourn is itself a form of respect for what has been made, and the tradition that preserved the lament texts alongside the creation myths and the flood narratives and the Gilgamesh epic was a tradition that understood this, that saw grief not as weakness, but as the most honest expression of the value that living things and the things they create actually have. Rest now. The fan is steady. The room is quiet. The ancient voices have said in this part of the journey what they came to say. One more part remains, and it will carry everything into the final quiet of the night. 3,000 years. That is how long the Mesopotamian scribal tradition maintained the stories we have been following tonight, from the first clay tablets pressed in the temple complexes of early Sumerian cities to the last cuneiform inscriptions made in the 1st century of the Common Era. 3,000 years of copying and teaching and preserving and adapting, of carrying the core of the tradition through the political changes that transformed Sumer into Akkad, into Babylon, into Assyria, and back into Babylon again, through invasions and conquests and the fall and rise of entire civilizations, through all the disruptions that 3 millennia of history in one of the most contested regions of the ancient world can produce. That continuity is itself one of the most remarkable facts about the tradition, and understanding it requires understanding something about why the scribal class of ancient Mesopotamia treated the preservation of this particular body of knowledge as a priority worth the effort of maintaining across such an extended span of time. The scribes were not simply archivists. They were not preserving old texts because the texts were old and therefore inherently valuable. They were preserving them because the knowledge the texts contained was understood to be practically necessary for the civilization's ability to function and to understand itself. The specific knowledge that the Anunnaki mythology preserved and transmitted was not astronomical data, or agricultural technique, or administrative procedure, all of which the scribal tradition also preserved, and all of which were immediately practical in obvious ways. The knowledge encoded in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh cycle, and the hymns to Enlil and Enki, was knowledge about the structure of power and the nature of authority, and the relationship between governance and creation, about what makes a divine decision legitimate and what makes it catastrophic, about the obligations that the powerful owe to what they govern and what they have created. This was knowledge that was directly relevant to the scribe's daily professional existence, Because the scribes worked in institutions, temples and palaces and royal libraries that were themselves organized according to hierarchies of authority, and that were constantly navigating the tension between the principle of order that maintained institutional function and the principle of creativity that kept institutions capable of responding to new situations. The scribe who copied the Atrahasis epic was not engaging with an abstract theological question about the nature of divine authority. He was engaging with the most concrete and immediate question of his professional life. How do you navigate an institutional hierarchy in which formal authority and genuine knowledge are not always aligned, in which the person with the power to make decisions and the person with the understanding to make good decisions are sometimes different people, in which the obligation to follow legitimate procedure and the obligation to act on genuine wisdom sometimes point in different directions? These are the questions that the Enlil-Enki conflict poses in cosmic form, and they are the questions that any person working within a complex institution faces in a more modest but equally real form every day. This is why the mythology was preserved with such care and copied with such attention. Not because it was entertaining, though it was that too. Not because it was theologically authoritative, though the scribes certainly treated it as such. But because it was genuinely useful, because the understanding it encoded was an understanding that helped people navigate the complex institutional realities of their professional lives more wisely than they could navigate them without it. The ancient Mesopotamians were not the last civilization to discover that the stories a culture tells about the relationship between authority and wisdom have direct consequences for how people within that culture make decisions about when to follow the rules and when to work around them, about what obligations persist in the face of institutional pressure to abandon them, about what it means to act with genuine integrity when integrity and compliance point in different directions. These are the questions that the Enlil-Enki conflict poses, and they are questions that every person in every institution in every period of history faces in one form or another. What the Sumerian scribal tradition offered was a framework for thinking about these questions that was sophisticated enough to acknowledge their genuine difficulty without pretending to resolve them cleanly. The mythology does not say that Enki was simply right and Enlil was simply wrong. It says that both principles are real and necessary, that the world requires both the ordering impulse of formal authority and the creative generosity of deep knowledge, and that the tragedy of the first Anunnaki war was not that one side was evil, but that the structure of the divine world had not found a way to hold both of them together without their incompatibility producing catastrophe. That acknowledgement of genuine difficulty is what distinguishes the Sumerian tradition from many of the religious and philosophical traditions that succeeded it. Later traditions tended to resolve the tension in one direction or another, either by subordinating creative wisdom to divine authority or by elevating individual wisdom above institutional constraint. The Sumerian tradition held the tension without resolving it, acknowledging that the world contains both principles and that neither can be eliminated without loss, that the work of civilization is the ongoing management of the tension rather than its final resolution. The physical setting in which these texts were produced adds another layer of meaning to the tradition they embody. The temple complexes of ancient Sumer, where the scribal schools operated and where the tablets were stored and copied, were themselves the most visible expressions of the tension between order and creation in the ancient Mesopotamian world. The temples were institutions of enormous administrative complexity, managing agricultural production and storage and distribution across large territories, maintaining the ritual calendar that governed the community's relationship to the divine world, training the scribes and priests who administered the system. All of this was Enlil's world, formal, hierarchical, organized according to the MEE that defined how civilized life was supposed to work. But the temples were also the places where the creative tradition was maintained, where the hymns were composed and the myths were copied, and the students were taught to think as well as to administer, where the kind of understanding that Enki represented was cultivated alongside the administrative competence that Enlil required. The temple was both the institution of order and the school of wisdom, both the enforcement mechanism of the cosmic hierarchy and the training ground for the people who understood the cosmos deeply enough to know when the hierarchy needed to be worked around rather than simply obeyed. This dual function of the temple, as both the center of administrative authority and the seat of genuine wisdom, is a physical expression of the same tension that the mythology describes in cosmic terms. The scribes who moved through the temple complexes of Nippur and Eridu and Ur were navigating the same space that Enki navigated in the divine assembly. the space between formal authority and genuine knowledge, between the obligation to follow established procedure and the obligation to act on genuine understanding when the two things pulled in different directions. The Sumerian temple hymns, a collection of 42 hymns dedicated to the major temples and shrines of ancient Sumer, are a document that illustrates the lived reality of the divine-human relationship in a way that the narrative mythology sometimes obscures. Each hymn describes a specific temple, its location, its divine resident, its sacred function, and its relationship to the broader cosmic order. Taken together, they are a map of the sacred geography of the Sumerian world, a description of how the divine principles that the mythology articulated in narrative form were distributed across the physical landscape of the Mesopotamian plain in the form of specific sacred spaces where specific gods were present and specific human activities were understood to be divinely sanctioned. The distribution of temples across this landscape reflects the distribution of divine influence across the Sumerian world, and that distribution is itself a map of the ongoing management of the Enlil-Enki conflict in the post-flood period. Nippur, Enlil's city, was the administrative centre of the divine world, the place where the assembly gathered and where the divine decrees were announced and where the formal procedures of cosmic governance were enacted. Eridu, Enki's city, was the oldest and most sacred city in the tradition, the place where the underground waters surfaced and where the deep knowledge of the cosmos was accessible. The relationship between these two cities, between the formal authority of Nippur and the ancient wisdom of Eridu, was the geographical expression of the same tension that the mythological narrative expressed in the form of the conflict between the two brothers. Other cities in the sacred geography aligned themselves with one or the other of the two principles, or more often with both simultaneously, because the practical reality of urban life required both the administrative order that Enlil's patronage provided and the creative wisdom that Enki's presence enabled. The city of Uruk, where Inanna had brought the Emi from Enki's Abzu, and where the explosion of urban civilization that followed the distribution of the Emi had its most visible expression, was the city that most fully embodied the consequences of the creative principle unleashed in the world. Its walls, which the Gilgamesh epic celebrates as the most enduring expression of the hero's greatness, were both a practical achievement and a theological statement. The human capacity to build things that outlast individual human lives, the creative principle expressing itself in the most concrete and most durable form available to the human world. The walls of Uruk were not simply defensive structures. They were a demonstration that the human beings Enki had created were capable of more than the simple labour that the Igigi's revolt had required them to perform. They were capable of organisation on a scale that no individual human being's labour could achieve, of collective effort sustained across generations toward goals that no individual would live to see completed, of the kind of creative ambition that the divine blood in their composition made possible, and the earthly clay of their bodies ensured they would not live to see fully realised in any single lifetime. The walls were simultaneously an expression of what humans could do, and a reminder of what they could not escape. They would die, and the walls would remain, and the walls would remember what the people who built them would be forgotten for having been. This is the paradox that the Gilgamesh epic articulates most fully, and that the mythological tradition as a whole keeps returning to, the paradox of beings who are capable of making things that outlast them, but who cannot themselves outlast the things they make. It is the paradox of the divine blood and the clay, of the spark that enables creation, and the impermanence that limits the creator, of the ambition that makes civilization possible, and the mortality that ensures civilization is always, in some sense, a work in progress rather than a finished achievement. The ancient Mesopotamians found this paradox not unbearable but true, which is a different relationship to difficulty than finding it unbearable. They found it true, and they encoded it in their most durable medium, and they transmitted it across 3,000 years of their civilization's history, because they understood that the truth of it was not going to change, and that the wisdom of acknowledging it was more useful than the comfort of denying it. The walls of Uruk would stand, Gilgamesh would die. Both things were real, both things mattered, and the tradition that preserved both things, that refused to resolve the paradox by denying either of its elements, was a tradition that was trying to prepare its inheritors for the actual experience of being human, rather than for an idealized version of that experience that would shatter on first contact with mortality. That preparation is the deepest gift of the Sumerian mythological tradition, and it is what the ancient scribes were trying to transmit when they copied the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh cycle, and the hymns to Enlil and Enki and the lament texts and the temple hymns. Not doctrine, not reassurance, preparation. The kind of preparation that comes from having thought as clearly and as honestly as possible about the nature of the world and the nature of human existence within it, and from having encoded that thinking in a form durable enough to be transmitted across the generations of people who would need it. The Omen literature of ancient Mesopotamia is another dimension of the tradition that reveals how the theological framework of the Enlil-Enki conflict was translated into practical tools for navigating daily life. The Great Omen collections, the series of tablets that record thousands of specific signs and their interpretations, from celestial events to animal behaviours to the shapes of livers examined in divination, were not simply superstitious record-keeping. They were the practical application of a theological understanding that the divine world was in ongoing and complex communication with the human world, and that understanding the content of that communication was a skill that could be developed through careful observation and systematic analysis. The Omen tradition understood the divine world as something that could be partially read by those with the right training. Celestial events, the appearance of eclipses and the conjunctions of planets were Enlil's domain. The formal announcements of the divine assembly's decisions about the fate of kingdoms and kings, written in the sky where those with eyes to read them could see them. The behaviour of animals and the patterns found in the entrails of sacrificial victims were more subtle communications, requiring interpretation by priests trained in the specific meanings that the tradition had associated with specific signs over centuries of careful observation. Both kinds of omen reading required knowledge, and both kinds of knowledge were held by the scribal and priestly class that maintained the tradition. The Omen tradition was not simply about predicting the future in a passive sense. It was about understanding the divine world's current intentions well enough to respond to them appropriately, to make offerings that might mitigate unfavourable decrees, to take actions that aligned with favourable ones, to navigate the ongoing management of the divine-human relationship with the intelligence that the relationship required. This is Enki's approach, translated into practical procedure, the use of deep knowledge about the structure of things to find the appropriate response to a situation that authority alone cannot adequately manage. The scribes who maintained the Omen collections and the priests who applied them were the practical inheritors of Enki's theological legacy, the people in the human world who embodied the principle that deep knowledge of how things actually work is the most valuable form of power available to those who have to navigate a world they did not create and cannot fully control. They were doing, in their daily professional practice, what Enki had done in the divine assembly, using their understanding to find the response that the situation actually required, rather than simply applying the formal rules that the existing authority structure provided. This connection between the mythological tradition and the practical life of the scribal and priestly class is what made the tradition so durable. It was not simply a body of religious narrative preserved for its own sake. It was the theoretical foundation of a set of practical skills that were directly useful to the people who possessed them, skills that helped them perform their professional functions more effectively, and that gave them a framework for understanding the world complex enough to acknowledge its genuine difficulty without being paralyzed by it. The mythology was the theory. The Omen literature and the ritual practice and the administrative procedures of the temple were the application, and the connection between theory and application was maintained by the scribal tradition that taught both things together and treated the understanding of the divine conflict as the foundation for the practical knowledge that the tradition also transmitted. 3,000 years, every generation adding its own copy to the accumulation, its own interpretation to the tradition, its own application of the inherited understanding to the specific conditions of its own moment. The tradition was not static. It evolved, adapted, incorporated new material, responded to new political and cultural circumstances, but its core remained recognizable across the entire span of its existence, because the core was not a set of specific doctrines that might become outdated, but a set of questions that remained permanently relevant. What is authority for? What does it owe to creation? What distinguishes legitimate governance from the exercise of raw power? And what should a person do when wisdom and compliance pull in different directions? These questions were the living heart of the Sumerian scribal tradition, and they are living questions still, as relevant to the world of the present as they were to the world of ancient Mesopotamia. The specific mythological framework through which the tradition expressed them has not been believed in the literal sense for 2,000 years. But the questions remain, and the understanding that the tradition developed in the process of asking them remains, and the clay tablets that preserved that understanding remain, buried in museums and universities, and in the specific gravity of a tradition that travelled through fire and the fall of empires to reach this moment. The debate between sheep and grain is one of the oldest surviving examples of a literary form that ancient Mesopotamia developed with particular sophistication. The disputatio, or debate text, in which two principles or figures argue their respective claims to superiority before a divine judge. The tradition includes debates between summer and winter, between silver and copper, between the hoe and the plough, between the bird and the fish. Each debate takes a pair of opposing principles and stages their competition in a way that requires the audience to think carefully about the relative merits of each. The debate between sheep and grain is the most philosophically charged of these texts in the context of the Enlil-Enki conflict, because the specific pair it stages is a pair that maps precisely onto the theological division we have been tracing throughout tonight's journey. Sheep represents the pastoral, the herded, the managed, the principle of maintaining what exists by careful stewardship and incremental improvement. Grain represents the agricultural, the cultivated, the transformed, the principle of taking the raw material of the natural world and doing something genuinely new with it, producing through creative labour something that would not exist without deliberate intervention. The argument that sheep makes is recognisable as Enlil's argument: stability, continuity, the value of maintaining a proven system, rather than risking the disruptions that innovation produces. The argument that grain makes is recognisable as Enki's argument: the value of creative transformation, the greater abundance that comes from doing the work of genuine cultivation, rather than simply managing what naturally exists. The judgment that the divine world renders in the surviving version of the text favours grain. The principle of creative transformation is judged more fundamental than the principle of pastoral management. This judgment is a direct theological statement, embedded in the most accessible and concrete terms possible. The creativity that produces grain from seed is more valuable than the management that tends to sheep. The scribes who preserved this text were not simply recording an agricultural debate. They were making a theological claim about the relative importance of the two divine principles in conflict, and they were making it in a form that any person who had ever seen a field of grain growing could immediately understand. The abstract cosmic conflict between Enlil and Enki was being translated into the language of everyday economic life, made accessible to anyone who ate bread and understood where bread came from. This translation of cosmic conflict into everyday language is one of the most characteristic features of the Sumerian tradition, and one of its most important contributions to the later religious and literary traditions that inherited it. The ability to speak about the deepest questions of power and authority and the nature of the good in the language of daily life, without reducing those questions to simple allegory or stripping them of their complexity, is a skill that the Sumerian scribal tradition developed over centuries and that it passed on in various forms to every tradition that followed it. The Hebrew prophets who used agricultural and pastoral imagery to speak about divine justice were working in a tradition that ultimately traces back to the debate between sheep and grain, and the temple hymns and the mythological texts that encoded the Enlil-Enki conflict in the language of the natural world. The physical landscape of the Mesopotamian plain was itself a participation in this tradition. The rivers and the canals and the fields and the cities that the human population had built and maintained across the millennia of Mesopotamian civilization were not simply the setting in which the tradition unfolded. They were the medium through which the tradition expressed itself, the material in which the abstract principles of the mythology were embodied in concrete form. When the ancient Mesopotamians looked at a canal and saw Enki's generosity expressed in the availability of water, or looked at a city wall and saw Enlil's order expressed in the security it provided, they were reading the landscape as a text that spoke in the same language as the clay tablets in the temple libraries. This integration of theological understanding and physical landscape was not metaphorical for the ancient Mesopotamians, it was literal. The divine world was present in the physical world in the same way that the principles of the Emi were present in the institutions that embodied them, not as distant abstractions but as the real structure of things, the actual reason that things worked the way they did and failed the way they failed. The flood had been real water. The silence afterward had been real silence. The offering smoke that gathered the gods around it after the flood had been real smoke rising from a real fire on a real mountain. The divine conflict was not a story about something that happened in a different realm. It was the explanation for why things in this realm were the way they were. There is a specific moment in the Gilgamesh epic that has always struck those who read it carefully as one of the most honest and most beautiful passages in ancient literature, and it comes in an unexpected place. In the advice given to Gilgamesh by a tavern keeper named Siduri, whom he encounters on his quest for immortality. Siduri is a minor figure in the narrative, a woman who sells ale in a tavern at the edge of the world, and her advice to the grieving king is not elevated or philosophical in any formal sense. It is practical, warm, and direct. She tells him, "When the gods created humanity, they allotted death for humanity, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry each day and night, of each day make a feast, dance and play day and night. Let your garments be sparkling fresh, your head be washed, bathe in water, look at the child who holds your hand, let your spouse delight in your embrace." These are the concerns of mankind. This is not a theological argument. It is not a conclusion drawn from the mythology of the Enlil-Enki conflict. It is a simple human wisdom, offered by a woman who sells ale at the edge of the world, to a king who has spent the second half of his narrative life trying to escape the condition that the simple wisdom accepts. And the text presents it not as the answer to Gilgamesh's quest, but as the wisdom that his quest, in its very failure, was leading him toward. The advice Siduri gives is the mythology's way of saying what the divine conflict, for all its cosmic scale and theological complexity, was ultimately about from the human point of view. The gods fought over whether to preserve or destroy the beings they had made. The beings they had made, the ones in whose creation Enki had invested his deepest knowledge, and for whose survival he had found the gap in the assembly's decree, were beings who could be happy with a full belly and a clean garment, and a child's hand and a spouse's embrace. Not immortality, not divine status, not the escape from the mortality that the clay in their composition had always ensured. Just this, the full use of the life available, attended to completely, not diminished by the grief of what it cannot be. The ancient scribes who preserved this passage understood what they were preserving. They were preserving the human answer to the divine conflict, the answer that does not require the conflict to be resolved, or the incompatibility between the divine principles to be reconciled. It is simply the recognition that the life available, even in its limitation, even in its mortality, even in the face of divine authorities who cannot agree about whether it should exist, is worth living fully. That recognition is what Enki had always been protecting. Not an idea, not a theological position. This, the child's hand, the spouse's embrace, the clean garment, the full belly, the day and the night and the capacity to be present in both. That is what the first Anunnaki war was about, at its most fundamental level, not power, not procedure, not the balance between formal authority and generative knowledge, though all of those things were real parts of the conflict. It was about whether the beings who could be happy with a child's hand and a clean garment deserved to exist, whether the world was better with them in it or without them, whether the creative generosity that had brought them into being was worth the noise they made when they were alive. Enki said yes. Enlil said the noise was too much, and the world that emerged from the conflict between those two answers is the world that still contains us, still noisy, still mortal, still making things that outlast us, and still unable to outlast the things we make. The fan turns softly. The night is ready to release you into sleep. 4,000 years ago, in a room lit by oil lamps in a city that is now rubble under the Iraqi plain, a scribe pressed these stories into wet clay and set them aside to dry. They are still here. You are still here. The distance between those two facts is everything that happened in between, and what happened in between, all of it, was the continuation of the story that the ancient scribes were trying to preserve. The story of the beings made of clay and divine blood, too mortal to escape death, and too capable to accept it without grief, making things and losing things and making things again, generation after generation, in the world that the first Anunnaki war produced, and that we still inhabit now. The city of Eridu, Enki's oldest city, is now a site of low mounds and scattered brick in the southern Iraqi desert. The archaeologists who excavated it in the middle of the 20th century found what they had hoped to find: Layer upon layer of temple construction, 17 successive shrine levels built one on top of the other across a span of time reaching back to the earliest period of Mesopotamian settlement, each generation building on the foundations of the one before, each new shrine a little larger and a little more elaborate than the last, but all of them occupying the same sacred spot on the same landscape that the earlier settlers had understood as the place where the underground waters of the Abzu came closest to the surface. The physical continuity of that sacred site, maintained across 3,000 years of construction and reconstruction, and the political changes that transformed Sumer into Akkad into Babylon, is a physical testimony to something the mythology could only describe in narrative form. The persistence of Enki's principle in the world, the endurance of the creative and generative as a value that the forces of administrative management cannot permanently eliminate. Cities fell, dynasties changed. The political centre of the Mesopotamian world moved from Eridu to Nippur to Babylon and back again. But the site at Eridu remained sacred, and the god associated with it remained relevant, and the principle he represented continued to be honoured, in the same spot where it had first been recognised as present. What the excavators found when they reached the lowest levels of the Eridu shrine was a simple platform of mud brick, a rectangular podium a few metres across on which the earliest temple had stood, so small and so simple that it would be easy to dismiss it as barely worth the designation of temple at all. But the continuity between that simple platform and the elaborate shrine complexes that were built above it across 3,000 years of successive construction is the physical embodiment of what the mythology was always saying, that the deepest things start small, that the most durable foundations are sometimes the most modest, and that what endures is not always what is most impressive at any given moment, but what has roots deep enough to persist through all the changes that time and circumstance produce. The underground waters of the Abzu are still there beneath the southern Iraqi plain. They are still the deepest fresh water in the region, still the aquifer that feeds the rivers and the springs and the wells of the Mesopotamian heartland. The god who was believed to command those waters has not been worshipped in 2,000 years, but the waters are there, and the tradition that understood them as the domain of the god of wisdom is there, preserved in the clay tablets that outlasted the civilization that produced them, speaking to us now in a translation of words pressed into clay by hands that have been dust for 4,000 years. The fan turns with the steadiness that long repetition produces, the same motion cycle after cycle, the same sound settling into the background until it becomes part of the silence rather than a disruption of it. That is what 4,000 years of transmission does to an idea. It settles into the background of the culture that carries it, becomes part of the assumptions rather than the explicit content of the tradition, stops being something that has to be argued for, and becomes something that is simply true in the way that the deepest and most honestly observed things become true. Not because authority has decreed it, but because experience keeps confirming it, generation after generation, in the lives of the people who inhabit the world that the ancient conflict shaped. The night is ready. The story has been told. The fan will keep turning after you're asleep, steady and present, as patient as the clay tablets in their museum cases, as patient as the underground waters in the deep rock beneath the desert. Whatever wakes you in the morning will be the morning's business. What you carry from tonight is the beginning of an understanding that took the world's oldest literate civilization 3,000 years to develop, and that they pressed into clay and sent forward through fire and silence to reach you here. Rest now. We have travelled a long way tonight. We began with the structure of the divine family and the original arrangement of the cosmos, with Anu at the summit and Enlil and Enki below him, each holding a different form of power in a hierarchy that had been organised with less attention to how those different forms of power would interact than to the immediate practical requirements of getting a world built and running. We followed the thread through the Igigi rebellion and the creation of humanity as the solution to the labour crisis, through the repeated cycles of Enlil's unilateral plague decrees and Enki's quiet counter-interventions, through the flood and the devastating silence that followed it, through the negotiated post-flood settlement and the distribution of the ME and the literary traditions that encoded the conflict's meaning in the most durable language available to the ancient world. In the parts that came before this one, we have traced the theological and philosophical dimensions of what the ancient scribes understood about the war. That its trigger was not any single act of transgression, but the structural incompatibility built into the cosmos from its original division. that the incompatibility was between formal authority and generative knowledge, between the principle that manages and the principle that creates, and that the human beings caught between those two principles in the space the conflict opened are the most direct expression of both principles simultaneously, carrying in their clay and blood the irreducible tension between what they are and what they will always want to become. Tonight, in this final part, I want to do something different with what we have been given. Rather than continuing to trace the argument forward, I want to sit with it, to think about what it means that the oldest written civilization in the world chose to preserve, as its most important body of literature, a set of stories about a divine conflict that its resolution could not end, about the permanent structural tension between two principles of governance, and about human beings who are created in the space between those principles, and who carry the marks of that creation in everything they do and everything they are. Because the ancient Mesopotamians, in choosing to preserve these stories with such care and such consistency across such an extended span of time, were telling us something specific about how they understood the world, and what they were saying deserves to be heard clearly rather than filtered through the distortions of distance and time. They were saying that the world is not organised for human comfort. This is perhaps the most consistent and most honest message embedded in the entire Sumerian mythological tradition, and it stands in interesting contrast to the more familiar religious traditions that many people in the modern world were raised with, traditions that promise divine attention and divine care, and the ultimate compatibility between what the divine world wants and what human beings need. The Sumerian tradition does not make that promise. The gods of Sumer created humans to solve their own problem, not out of love for the idea of human beings. The creation of humanity was a pragmatic decision made under pressure, and the beings produced by that decision were not the primary focus of divine attention, but the secondary consequence of a divine labour negotiation. And yet, within the tradition's very refusal to make the comfortable promise, there is something more honest and in many ways more useful. The recognition that the world contains, as a structural feature rather than as a guarantee, a principle that values creation for its own sake. The principle that Enki embodied, the understanding that what has been made has a claim on the protection of those who made it, that the act of creation imposes obligations that persist regardless of administrative convenience, that the deepest form of wisdom is not the enforcement of existing order, but the capacity to respond to new situations with new creation. This principle is not a guarantee. It does not promise that human beings will always be protected or always be valued or always survive the forces that would manage them out of existence. But it is real, and it has weight in the structure of the world, and its presence is what made the difference between a world drowned in silence and a world from which a single man emerged from a vessel onto a mountain and made the offering smoke that brought the gods together around it. The ancient Mesopotamians found comfort not in the promise of divine protection, but in the honesty of this framework, in the knowledge that the world was complex, that the forces that shaped it were real and permanent, and in genuine tension, and that navigating that tension with wisdom and attention and genuine understanding was the most that human beings could do, and, in many ways, the most that needed to be done. Not salvation, not transcendence. Clear-eyed navigation of a genuinely complex world, attended by the principle of creative generosity, when that principle was strong enough to operate and prepared for its absence when it was not. This preparation, this readiness for genuine difficulty, is what the Sumerian tradition's theological honesty produced as its most practical legacy. The civilization that maintained the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh cycle, and the lament texts, and the hymns to Enlil and Enki across 3,000 years of history was a civilization that had thought more carefully and more honestly about the nature of the world than most, and that had encoded that thinking in a form durable enough that the thinking is still available to anyone who looks for it. The Adaba, the tablet house where the scribal tradition was maintained and transmitted, was one of the oldest educational institutions in the world, and what it taught was not simply literacy or administrative skill, or the technical knowledge required for temple management. It taught a way of seeing the world, a framework for understanding the structures of power and knowledge in creation that made the world what it was, a set of questions to ask about any situation that required genuine decision-making rather than simple rule-following. The graduate of the Sumerian Adaba was a person who understood, in a deep and practically useful sense, that the world was organised by a tension that could not be resolved, and that wisdom lay in managing that tension rather than pretending it did not exist. That understanding is one that every generation has to rediscover for itself because the specific mythological framework through which the Sumerians expressed it has not been available in living form for 2,000 years, and the rediscovery has to be made through different frameworks in different periods of history. But the understanding itself is perennial, because the tension it describes is perennial, because the world still contains both the principle of order and the principle of creation, and they still do not fit together without friction, because human beings are still made of both clay and divine blood, and are still unable to escape the paradox that condition produces. The ancient scribes who pressed these stories into clay understood that they were doing something that would outlast them. They were participating in a chain of transmission that connected the present to the deep past, and that was intended to connect the present to an equally deep future, carrying through the fragile medium of clay tablets and the more fragile medium of human institutional continuity, the understanding that they believed mattered enough to preserve. They were right about the importance of the understanding. They may not have been right about the durability of the medium, since the tablets nearly were lost, since the civilization that produced them did not survive, since the chain of transmission was eventually broken and had to be reconnected by archaeologists and scholars working 2,000 years after the last cuneiformist had died. But the understanding survived the destruction of its original container, as understanding tends to do when it is genuinely true and genuinely useful, and it is here now, in the words that have travelled from those ancient tablet houses to wherever you are resting tonight. The fan turns, the room is quiet, the night has reached the place it was always heading toward, the moment when the ancient voices fall silent, and the silence they leave behind is full of what they said. What you carry from this journey is not the mythology itself, not the names of the gods, or the sequence of episodes in the Atrahasis epic, or the specific details of the flood narrative. What you carry is something more general and more durable than any of those things. The sense of what it means to have been thought about honestly by people who had every reason to find more comfortable answers and who refused to. The sense of what it means to be the creation that the creative principle refused to let be unmade. The noisy persistent being made of clay and divine blood who builds things that outlast it and who cannot escape the mortality that the clay ensures and who keeps building anyway, generation after generation, in the world that the first Anunnaki war produced. You are the noise that kept Enlil awake. You are the creation that Enki refused to let be destroyed. You are the being that Gilgamesh could not save from death, and that Siduri told to eat well and hold the child's hand and let the spouse delight in the embrace. You are the smoke rising from the offering fire that brought the gods together around it after the flood. You are all of these things simultaneously, and the tradition that told you so pressed those truths into clay more than 4,000 years ago and sent them forward through fire and silence to reach you here. Sleep now. The Tigris and the Euphrates are still flowing through the plains of what was once the cradle of the world. The stars that the Sumerian astronomers mapped with such precision are in the same positions they have always been. The underground waters of the Abzu are still in the deep rock beneath the desert, and somewhere in the structure of things, in the permanent tension between the principle that orders and the principle that creates, the story that the ancient scribes were trying to tell continues, in the lives of the beings it was told about, in the daily enactment of everything that being human, fully and honestly and without looking away from its difficulty actually is. Let the fan turn softly. Let the room grow still. Let the weight of the day and the weight of the ancient world settle into the mattress and the quiet. The story has been told. The night is ready to carry you forward. There is something that the mythology never quite says directly, but that emerges from the accumulated weight of all the texts we have followed tonight, from the Atrahasis epic through the Gilgamesh cycle, through the lament texts and the temple hymns and the debate texts. The sense that the ancient Mesopotamians understood their own civilization as an achievement that was always precarious, always maintained against the forces that would undo it, always dependent on the ongoing presence of both the principle of order that kept it structured and the principle of creation that kept it alive. Neither principle alone was sufficient. Both were necessary. And the tension between them, managed well, was not simply a problem to be solved, but the very condition of the civilization's possibility. This understanding, that civilization is possible only within a tension rather than despite it, is one of the most sophisticated insights in the history of human political thought, and the fact that it was first articulated in this specific form more than 4,000 years ago in a series of mythological narratives pressed into clay by anonymous scribes in the temple complexes of ancient Sumer, is one of the more humbling facts available to anyone who thinks seriously about the history of human intellectual development. We did not invent this understanding, we inherited it through the long and broken and sometimes near miraculous chain of transmission that carried the clay tablets of Sumer through the fires that baked them harder, through the centuries of burial in the Iraqi soil, through the archaeologists who dug them up and the cuneiformists who learned to read them, through the translators who brought the words back into living language and the scholars who traced the structure of thought embedded in the narrative, to the point where the understanding is available again, not as doctrine but as genuine intellectual inheritance, the thinking of people who thought carefully and honestly about the world that they lived in, and who left that thinking in the most durable form they had available. The ancient Mesopotamian scribes did not know that their tablets would be discovered. They did not know that cuneiformists 2,000 years after the last Babylonian scribe had died would reconstruct the writing system from scratch and bring the words back into legibility. They pressed the words into clay because the words mattered, because the understanding the words encoded was worth the effort of encoding it in the most durable available form, because they believed that genuine understanding was worth preserving regardless of whether the specific human beings who came after them would be able to receive it. They were right. The understanding survived. We received it. And the obligation that receiving it creates is the obligation that any genuine inheritance creates. To understand it as well as we can, to apply it as honestly as we can, and to pass it forward in the most durable form available to us, for the people who will come after us and who will need it in the same way that we need it now. The world the ancient scribes were trying to understand is the same world we inhabit. The tension they identified at its heart is the same tension we navigate in every institution we build, and every authority we submit to, and every creative act we attempt in the face of the forces that would prefer we did not. The beings they described, made of clay and divine blood, mortal and creative and incapable of accepting either their limitation or their capability without grief and without pride, are the beings we still are. Nothing about this has changed except the specific mythological framework through which the understanding was first expressed, and that framework, specific and ancient as it is, was not arbitrary. It encoded in the precise and memorable form of story a set of truths about the world that the truths themselves required a precise and memorable form to preserve. Rest now. The ancient world has said what it had to say. The understanding has arrived. What you do with it in the morning is the morning's question. For now, let the fan turn softly. Let the room grow very still. Let the breathing slow to the rhythm that the body knows when the mind has stopped needing to direct it. The city of Eridu is rubble in the Iraqi desert. The city of Nippur is rubble too. The tablets from their libraries are in museums in Baghdad and London and Philadelphia, and the understanding pressed into them is in this room now, settling like silt after a river has run past, taking the shape of whatever it settles into, becoming, in whatever form it takes in you, part of what you carry forward when the morning comes. The specific form that the Enlil-Enki conflict takes in the period after the Babylonian Empire had established itself, and the Enuma Elish had been composed, reveals something about the direction in which the tradition understood the conflict to be moving over the long span of time. In the earlier Sumerian sources, the two brothers are equally present and equally important, and the conflict between them is staged as a genuine contest, whose outcome is genuinely uncertain. The flood might have ended humanity. The gap in the decree might not have been found. The assembly might have been more attentive to Enki's quiet interventions and closed the loopholes he was using. The tension is real precisely because neither side has yet demonstrated a decisive advantage. But in the later Babylonian tradition, something has shifted. The elevation of Marduk, Enki's son, to the supreme position in the divine hierarchy is not simply a political statement about Babylonian dominance. It is a theological statement about the direction of the world's development over time. The world has been moving, across the centuries of mythological time that the tradition spans, toward a configuration in which the creative, knowledge-bearing principle is recognized as the most fundamental form of divine power. Enlil has not been eliminated. He retains his position. But the center of gravity has shifted, and the shift is understood as the product of genuine development rather than of mere political change. This developmental theology, the understanding that the divine world itself evolves over time toward a more adequate expression of the principles it contains, is one of the most sophisticated theological achievements of the ancient Mesopotamian tradition. It means that the conflict between Enlil and Enki is not simply a permanent standoff between two equally valid but incompatible principles, but a process in which the world is gradually discovering, through the accumulated experience of the consequences of each principle's dominance, which form of governance is more adequate to the genuine complexity of what the world is. The flood demonstrated the consequences of administrative authority unrestrained by creative wisdom. The survival of Utnapishtim demonstrated the value of the creative wisdom that found a way through the authority's decree, and the direction indicated by the demonstration is toward a world in which the creative wisdom is given more authority than the administrative management had previously granted it. This is not a simple victory of Enki over Enlil. It is a recognition that the world requires both principles and that the question of how they should be balanced has an answer. That experience, over sufficient time, reveals, toward the creative, toward the generative, toward the principle that finds new responses to new situations rather than applying fixed rules regardless of whether they fit. The Babylonian tradition's elevation of Marduk is its way of saying that the world has learned this lesson, that the flood's catastrophe has produced the understanding necessary to prevent its repetition, and that the understanding has taken institutional form in the theological recognition of creative wisdom as the supreme divine attribute. Whether the ancient Babylonians were right about this, whether the world actually moves in this direction over time, or whether it simply oscillates between the two principles without any cumulative development, is a question that history does not answer cleanly. There have been floods, in the figurative sense, in every period of history. Moments when administrative authority without wisdom has produced catastrophes whose consequences the surviving inhabitants have had to rebuild from. And there have been the equivalents of Enki's intervention in every period too. The people who found the gap in the decree, who maintained the value of creation in the face of forces that would have managed it out of existence, who built the vessel and sealed it with bitumen and came through the water with something worth preserving. The pattern is real even if its direction is not guaranteed. And the tradition that first identified the pattern, that gave it names and a narrative form and pressed it into clay and the lamplight of ancient temple complexes, is the tradition that made it possible for subsequent generations to recognize the pattern when they encountered it again in their own time and in their own specific circumstances. That recognition is itself a form of the creative wisdom that Enki embodied, the ability to understand what is happening by reference to the deep structure of things rather than simply experiencing it as an isolated event without precedent or explanation. The fan turns in the room where you're resting. The sound of it is steady and present, not quite white noise but close to it, the kind of sound that becomes part of the background rather than a foreground event. The ancient voices are settling into that kind of background presence too, not gone, not silent, but absorbed into the texture of what you know now that you did not know at the beginning of tonight's journey. That absorption is the best form of transmission, not doctrine memorized, not facts retained, but understanding metabolized, taken in and converted into the kind of quiet knowing that becomes available when needed, without having to be consciously retrieved. The story of the first Anunnaki war has been told. The trigger has been identified, not the noise, not the flood, but the original asymmetry built into the cosmic division, the gap between formal authority and generative knowledge that was never resolved and that produced, through a sequence of individually manageable crises, the catastrophe that revealed its full magnitude. The aftermath has been traced. The legacy has been located in the texts and the traditions and the cities and the physical landscape that the conflict shaped. And the human beings who were created in the space the conflict opened, who carry its marks in their clay and their blood, have been recognized for what they are. The noise that Enlil could not sleep for and the creation that Enki would not let be unmade, persisting in the world that the conflict produced, building things that outlast them and losing things that they built, in the steady rhythm that is the most fundamental truth about what it means to be alive in the world the ancient scribes described. Sleep now, the room is ready, the night is ready. The fan will keep turning after you are asleep, as patient as the clay tablets in their museum cases, as patient as the underground waters in the deep rock beneath the desert plain where the first cities were built. There is a practice in the ancient Mesopotamian ritual tradition that has not been mentioned yet in tonight's journey, and it deserves a place in this closing part because it speaks directly to the question of what the tradition understood itself to be doing and why. The practice is called Namburbum, a class of Mesopotamian ritual designed to avert evil omens. When a diviner read a sign that predicted disaster, the response was not simply to accept the predicted outcome as inevitable. The response was to perform a specific ritual, a combination of prayer and offering and symbolic action, that the tradition understood as capable of deflecting the predicted disaster and replacing it with a more favourable outcome. The Namburbum rituals were not simply wishful thinking, they were grounded in a specific theological understanding that the divine decrees, even when formally announced and appearing in the omen record as predictions, were not absolutely fixed and could be modified by appropriate ritual action. The divine assembly could decree disaster, but the relationship between divine intention and actual outcome was mediated by the ongoing exchange of offering and prayer and ritual attention that kept the divine-human relationship active, and that mediation created a space in which outcomes could be shifted if the right actions were taken at the right time, with the right understanding of what was required. This understanding is recognizably Enki's understanding, translated into the practical ritual vocabulary of the Mesopotamian religious tradition. The divine decree is not the last word. Knowledge of the structure of things creates a space between the decree and its execution, and in that space, appropriate action can shift the outcome. The Namburbum is the ritual equivalent of the warning through the wall of the reed hut, a technique for finding and using the gap between what the formal authority has announced and what can actually be made to happen by someone with the knowledge to find the gap and the wisdom to act on it correctly. The existence of the Namburbum tradition in Mesopotamian religious practice means that the theological understanding encoded in the Atrahasis epic was not simply a theoretical position. It was a practical framework that shaped the daily religious life of the civilization, that was embodied in specific ritual procedures that priests performed and scribes recorded and rulers funded, that was real in the most concrete sense. It was what people actually did when they encountered the evidence that divine authority had decreed something bad for them, and they wanted to find a way to change it. They did what Enki had always done. They used their knowledge to find the gap, and they used the gap to act. The transmission of this understanding from the mythological narrative to the practical ritual tradition, and back again, the way that the story of what Enki did in the divine assembly became the model for what priests did in the temple, and what individuals did in their private devotional life, is the most direct evidence of how completely the theology of the first Anunnaki war had been absorbed into the daily practical life of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The mythology was not separate from the practice. The practice was the mythology in action, and the understanding that connected them, the understanding that the world is organized by a tension between formal authority and generative knowledge, and that wisdom lies in learning to navigate that tension rather than in simply accepting whatever authority decrees, was the thread that ran through both and held both together. The scribble schools of ancient Sumer were not simply training administrators, they were training people to embody this understanding, to carry in their bodies and their habits and their automatic responses to difficult situations the kind of knowing that Enki represented. The knowing that is not separate from the knowledge of procedure and rule, but that goes deeper than that knowledge, that can read the gap between the letter and the substance, that can find the appropriate response to a specific situation, rather than simply applying the general rule that the formal authority provides. That kind of knowing is not teachable in the direct sense. You cannot hand it to someone and say, "Here, this is the thing." You can only create the conditions in which it has a chance to develop, by immersing people in the accumulated wisdom of the tradition, by having them copy the texts and sing the hymns and perform the rituals and learn the omen readings until the understanding is in their hands as well as their heads, until it is the automatic and reliable resource of a trained intelligence, rather than the consciously retrieved content of a learned fact. This is what the 3,000 years of the Sumerian scribal tradition were doing, in every tablet house in every city of the Mesopotamian plain, generation after generation. They were creating the conditions for the development of the kind of understanding that the mythology of the first Anunnaki war described as the most valuable thing in the cosmos. The wisdom that can find the gap between the formal decree and the actual situation, that can act on genuine understanding rather than formal compliance, that can protect what deserves to be protected even when the authority structure says it does not. The fan is steady. The room is still. The ancient scribes have been speaking through this telling for a long time tonight, and they have said, in this final part, what they were always building toward, not the story of what happened in the divine assembly, but the story of what that story was for, what the ancient Mesopotamians understood they were preserving when they pressed it into clay and taught it to their students and rebuilt it after every fire that threatened to consume it. They were preserving the knowledge of how to be human well, in a world that is genuinely complex, organized by genuine tensions that cannot be resolved and must be navigated, containing both the forces that would manage human life to the point of its elimination and the forces that find the gap in every such management and refuse to let the creation be unmade. That knowledge is the most durable thing the ancient world produced. It outlasted the civilizations that produced it. It is here now, in this moment, in the quiet of whatever room the fan is turning in, having travelled 4,000 years through fire and silence to arrive here exactly as it was when the first scribe pressed it into the first wet clay. Take it with you into sleep. It will be there when you wake. The city of Nippur, Enlil's city, was not abandoned after the fall of the Babylonian Empire. It continued to be inhabited across the Persian period and the Hellenistic period, and well into the early centuries of the Common Era, maintained by communities that no longer worshipped Enlil in the old way, but that continued to occupy the sacred ground he had sanctified, continued to farm the fields that the ancient canal systems had made productive, continued to live in the landscape that the divine conflict had shaped. The site is still inhabited by scholars in a different sense today. Archaeologists who have been excavating Nippur since the 1880s have recovered hundreds of thousands of clay tablets from the site, making it one of the richest sources of cuneiform documentation in the world. Among the tablets recovered from Nippur are some of the most important surviving texts of the Sumerian literary tradition, including some of the oldest versions of the creation myths and flood narratives we have been following tonight. The fact that these texts were preserved at Nippur, Enlil's city, the administrative centre of the divine world, rather than at Eridu, Enki's city, the ancient seat of wisdom, is itself a comment on the relationship between the two principles that the mythology describes. The centre of formal authority preserved the record of its own conflict with creative wisdom. The administrative capital of the divine world stored the texts that most clearly articulated the limits of administrative authority. The texts and the city that stored them were in a sense enacting the theology they described. Formal authority containing within its institutional structure the knowledge of its own limitations. This is not a paradox that the ancient Mesopotamians would have found surprising. They understood that a well-functioning institution contained both the principle of order that maintained its structure and the principle of wisdom that kept it capable of responding to situations the structure had not anticipated. A temple administration that knew only how to enforce the rules it had been given was a temple administration that would fail in exactly the way Enlil's administration had failed in the flood narrative, by applying fixed rules to a situation that required a new response and producing catastrophe as a result. A temple administration that also cultivated the kind of understanding that allowed it to recognize when the rules needed to be worked around was a more durable and more adequate institution, capable of the kind of intelligent response to novel situations that survival required. The clay tablets that preserve this understanding are in museums now, behind glass, accessible to scholars who can read cuneiform and to everyone else through translations and digital images, and the growing secondary literature that makes the ancient world's most important texts available to people who could not otherwise encounter them. The accessibility of the ancient Mesopotamian tradition to the modern world is itself a kind of ongoing enactment of the tradition's values. The knowledge pressed into clay by people whose names we mostly do not know, preserved through catastrophes that destroyed everything around it, transmitted across 2,000 years of silence by the archaeologists and scholars who reconnected the broken chain of transmission, is now available to anyone who wants it, in any language, at any hour of the day or night. This availability is not accidental. It is the product of deliberate choices made by many generations of people who understood, as the ancient scribes understood, that genuine knowledge is worth the effort of preserving and transmitting, that the understanding encoded in the most important texts of any tradition is a common possession of the human species rather than the private property of any particular civilization or period, and that making it available to as many people as possible is one of the most valuable things that can be done with it. The fan is still turning. The night is still here. What you carry from tonight is yours now, absorbed into whatever you make of it, available when it is needed in the way that genuinely metabolized understanding becomes available. Not as something that has to be looked up, but as something that is simply there, a resource that was not there before, and that is now part of the automatic equipment of an intelligence that has been shaped by contact with one of the most honest and most durable bodies of thought that the human world has produced. Take it with you into sleep. Let the night carry you forward. The ancient world has done what it was built to do. It has transmitted its understanding to someone who will carry it for a while, and pass it on in whatever form the carrying transforms it into, in the long and never fully predictable chain of transmission that is the only form of immortality that the clay and the divine blood together actually make possible. Good night. Thank you for being here with us at Vestigia. Wherever tonight finds you, rest easy. The journey continues.